For 50 years, people have assumed that the man standing closest to Prince Philip must have been sitting on something sordid. He was sitting on something else. He never put it down, and he took it with him. At about 2:45 on the afternoon of the 6th of February, 1952, a naval officer named Mike Parker got down on his hands and knees on the floor of a lodge in the Kenyan highlands and began to crawl. The lodge was called Sagana. It had been given to Princess Elizabeth and her husband as a wedding present by the people of Kenya, and it sat about 20 miles from the fig tree they had slept in the night before. The air that afternoon was thin and clean and smelled of eucalyptus and dust. Outside, the light was doing what equatorial light does in the early afternoon, which is very little that anyone would call beautiful. Inside, two people were resting. Philip was in an armchair with a newspaper. Elizabeth was at a desk on the other side of the room, and she was writing a letter to her father. Parker had come in through the door a moment earlier with news he could not say out loud. Martin Charteris had heard it in Nyeri, in a restaurant, from a journalist who assumed everyone already knew. Charteris had come back and found Parker and told him, and now Parker had to establish whether it was true before anyone in that room was told anything at all. There was a wireless set against the wall. To reach it, he had to cross the room. To cross the room upright was to enter the princess's line of sight, and a princess who looks up from a letter and sees her husband's equerry moving strangely will ask a question, and the question would arrive before the confirmation did. So he went down onto the floor and crawled under her eyeline to the wall, and he turned the dial, and he brought the volume down so low that he had to put his head close to the speaker to hear anything at all. Every station was playing the same thing. Slow music, the sort that is only ever played for one reason, running on every frequency he could find. He stayed down there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he stood up, and he caught Philip's eye, and he tipped his head toward the door. We will come back to that room. What happened in the next 90 seconds is the reason this story exists at all, and it deserves more time than a cold open can give it. What matters now is the man on the floor. Lieutenant Commander John Michael Avison Parker was 31 years old that afternoon. He was Australian. He had been Philip's private secretary for 5 years and his friend for 10, and he was the only person in Kenya who understood in that moment exactly what was about to be taken away from the man in the armchair, because he was the only person there who had known him before any of it started. He would spend the next 5 years as the closest thing Prince Philip had to a brother. Then, on the 6th of February, 1957, 5 years to the day, the same date, the same man, it ended, in public, in a way that destroyed him. And for the 44 years between that morning and his death in a Melbourne hospital in December 2001, Mike Parker never told anyone what he knew. Not in a book. He was offered them. Not in an interview. He was offered those too, repeatedly, by people prepared to pay serious money. He said one thing on the record about Philip's private life in nearly half a century, and even that was a denial rather than a disclosure, which we will come to at the end. Here is what makes him worth 3 hours of anyone's attention. The job Parker held has a title that sounds ornamental. An equerry is, on paper, an attendant. A private secretary is, on paper, a man who manages a diary. In practice, at that level, in that household, the role meant something closer to the only honest mirror in a building full of flattering glass. Everyone else in Philip's life had a reason to shape what they said to him. Ministers had positions. Courtiers had careers. His wife had a country. Parker had none of that, because Parker had known him when neither of them had anything at all, and that is a kind of intimacy that no institution can manufacture and no institution can quite tolerate, which is why the palace never really wanted him there, and why it took the palace precisely 10 years to remove him. The version of Mike Parker that survived in the British press is a footnote in somebody else's rumour. A hard-drinking colonial who ran the Duke's social life got caught in a divorce and was quietly disposed of before the smell reached the throne. That version has been recycled for 70 years, put into television dramas, and repeated by people who have never checked a date. It is wrong in almost every particular. It is wrong about what he did, wrong about why he left, wrong about who ended it, and wrong about what happened afterwards. The correction is not flattering to the institution, which may be why nobody has been in a hurry to make it. It begins nowhere near a palace. It begins in a suburb of Melbourne in the winter of 1920, in a naval family with 6 children and 4 sons, all 4 of whom would end up in uniform, in a house where a boy learned very early that a man is measured by what he can be relied upon to do, and by absolutely nothing else. That boy would grow up on the far side of the world from the British court, with no title, no money worth the name, and no instinct whatsoever for bowing. And in the summer of 1942, in the North Sea, on a destroyer with a bad reputation and an unhappy crew, he would meet a 21-year-old Greek prince who had no country, no fortune, and nowhere in particular to go when the war ended. Neither of them had the faintest idea what the other one was going to cost him. The Parkers were a service family in a country that had only recently acquired a service to belong to. John Michael Avison Parker was born in Melbourne on the 23rd of June 1920, which in the Southern Hemisphere means he was a winter child. His father was Charles Avison Parker, a captain in the Royal Australian Navy, an organisation barely older than some of the men serving in it, formed in 1911, blooded almost immediately, in a war that had taken a generation of Australian sons and sent a great many of them to Gallipoli and the Western Front, and nowhere at all afterwards. His mother was Mary. There were 6 children, 4 boys and twin girls. All 4 boys went into the services. Not one of them, not 2, not 3, all of them. That statistic is usually offered as a charming fact about a patriotic household, and it is worth sitting with a little longer than that, because it tells you something about the atmosphere in which the 4th child of that family learned what a life was supposed to look like. It was not presented as a choice that had been considered and then made. It was the shape of the air in the house. You grew, and then you served, and the only genuinely open question was in which branch and on whose ship. Australia in the 1920s was a country in the middle of an argument with itself about what it actually was. It had a British monarch, British law, British schools, British regiments, and a British accent it was steadily failing to maintain. It also had a very fresh memory of having sent tens of thousands of its own men to die under British command, and a growing private suspicion that the affection ran considerably harder in one direction than the other. You could be entirely loyal to the crown in that country, and simultaneously entirely uninterested in being impressed by it. Millions of people managed both at once. It is a difficult posture to explain to anyone raised inside the English class system, and it explains almost everything about how Mike Parker later behaved in a room full of courtiers. He was educated at Xavier College in Melbourne, Jesuit, academically serious, sport-obsessed, and not remotely designed to produce a boy who would defer to a man simply because the man's grandfather had owned some land. The Jesuits were interested in whether you could think and whether you could take a hit. They were not particularly interested in whether your family was fashionable. Xavier turned out lawyers and doctors and a very large number of officers, and it did so by a method that would have been recognizable to any English public school, with one significant difference. The boys arriving at the gate did not already know their place in a national hierarchy, because there was no national hierarchy for them to know their place in. What formed instead was a specific temperament, and it is one that anyone who has spent time around Australians of that generation will recognize instantly. Direct to the point of rudeness by English standards, physically confident, comfortable with authority when the authority had done something to earn it, and openly contemptuous of it when it hadn't. Funny, usually at somebody's expense, occasionally his own. Warm without being sentimental, deeply, unshowily loyal to a small number of people, in a way that did not require announcement and did not admit of negotiation. That last quality is the one that decided his life. It is important to be precise about it, because it is the difference between the Mike Parker of the record and the Mike Parker of the tabloids. His loyalty was not a strategy. He did not calculate that silence would serve him, and it is worth noting early that it did not serve him. It cost him a career, a marriage, a reputation, and a continent. He was not a discreet man in the professional sense. He talked a great deal, and he was funny, and he was indiscreet about almost everything in the world, except the one subject on which he was immovable. He simply had a reflex, formed early in a house full of brothers, that certain people were yours, and you did not sell them. Ever, under any circumstances. Regardless of what it did to you. Boys who grow up with that reflex tend to make excellent junior officers. They tend to make catastrophic courtiers. There was money in the family, but not the kind that makes anything easy. A naval captain's pay, in interwar Australia, was respectable and finite. 6 children is 6 children. The Parkers were comfortable in the way that a professional family is comfortable, which is to say the house was decent, the schooling was paid for, and nobody was ever confused about the fact that the money came from work. This matters more than it sounds, because it means that when Parker arrived, 20 years later, in a world where enormous inherited wealth coexisted with a permanent low-grade anxiety about cash, he found the whole arrangement faintly ridiculous. He never quite got over it. Neither, for entirely different reasons, did Philip. By his mid-teens, the direction was already set. Europe was doing what Europe does, approximately every third generation. The newspapers arriving in Melbourne carried news from Germany that took 3 weeks to reach the letterbox and required no translation once it did. In a house where 4 boys were being pointed at the services, nobody needed a family conference to work out what was coming. Parker joined the Royal Navy in 1938. Not the Australian Navy his father had served in, the Royal Navy, the Imperial one, which meant leaving. He was 18, he would not live in Australia again for 20 years, and when he finally came back, he would arrive as a divorced man in his late 30s, with his name in every newspaper in Britain, for reasons he had chosen not to explain. But that was a long way off, and no part of it was visible from Melbourne in 1938. What was visible was a boy on a ship heading north, out of a winter into a summer, toward a war that had not quite started, carrying with him a set of instincts formed at the other end of the earth. 19 months later, those instincts would be tested off the coast of Norway, in a fjord, in the snow, in the first genuine catastrophe of his adult life. Narvik is a town at the end of a fjord, in the Norwegian Arctic, and in 1940, it was the most valuable strip of waterfront in Europe. The reason was iron. Swedish iron ore, some of the finest in the world, came out of the mines at Kiruna and travelled west by rail to the Norwegian coast, because the Swedish Baltic ports froze, and Narvik, warmed by the tail end of the Gulf Stream, did not. German steel production depended on that ore. German steel production was the German war. Everyone on both sides understood this perfectly well, which is why a fishing town of a few thousand people, 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle, became one of the first places in the war where large numbers of men killed each other. The Germans landed there on the 9th of April. The Royal Navy arrived the following morning. What happened over the next 2 months is not a story anybody in Britain particularly wanted to tell afterwards, because although the naval actions were a genuine and expensive success, 2 battles in the fjord, a German destroyer force effectively annihilated, the campaign as a whole was a shambles. Troops landed without the right equipment, air cover that was not there, orders that changed, then changed back. A town taken at real cost in late May and abandoned in early June because France was collapsing and every man was needed elsewhere. Mike Parker was 19 years old. We do not have his account of it. He was not a man who produced accounts. But we know he was there, and we know what being there involved, and the details are not obscure. It involved cold of a specific and stupid kind. Not the dramatic cold of an expedition, which men prepare for, but the daily grinding cold of steel decks in an Arctic spring, where the air temperature is survivable, and the water is not, and every man on board carries a private arithmetic about how long he would last in it. The answer, in those waters, was about 4 minutes before the body stopped cooperating. It involved light that never went away. By late May, that far north, the sun does not properly set, and men stood watches in a permanent grey daylight that ruined sleep and made the ordinary human sense of a day dissolve into a continuous alertness that eventually stopped feeling like anything. It involved bombing. The Luftwaffe operated over those fjords more or less at will, and the ships had almost nothing effective to answer with. This is a particular kind of experience for a sailor. The enemy is above you, you cannot reach him, and your job is to stand where you have been told to stand, and continue doing your work while other people try to hit you. And it involved watching ships sink with men inside them. There is a thing that happens to a certain type of young man in that environment, and it is not what films suggest. He does not become haunted. He becomes clarified. Parker came out of Norway with a set of convictions he never afterwards revised, and every one of them is visible in his behavior 15 years later in a palace. The first was about competence. In a fjord under air attack, a man's family, accent, education, and connections are precisely as useful as the actual thing he can do with his hands and his head in the next 30 seconds, which is to say, not at all useful. Parker spent 2 months in an environment that sorted men with total honesty and no reference whatsoever to their social position. He was never able to unsee it. When he later walked into a royal household organized almost entirely around social position, he did not find it impressive or intimidating. He found it inefficient, and he said so, and this did not make him popular. The second was about panic. He learned, at 19, that panic is contagious, and that the contagion runs downward, from whoever is nominally in charge. A frightened officer produces a frightened deck. A calm one produces a functioning one, regardless of how the calm officer actually feels. That is not a theory you acquire from reading. You acquire it by standing somewhere unpleasant and watching it happen in both directions. Hold that one in mind. 12 years later, on the floor of a lodge in Kenya, a man with news that would upend a nation will decline to walk across a room in a way that might alarm a woman writing a letter. That instinct was manufactured in Norway. The third was about loyalty under fire, and it is the least fashionable of the three. Warships are small. A destroyer in 1940 carried somewhere in the region of 150 to 200 men in a hull the length of a suburban street, and after a few weeks, there was no private life left in it whatsoever. Men learned each other's habits, snoring, fears, and finances. They also learned, with total certainty, which of them could be depended on and which could not, and that judgment once formed was essentially permanent. Out of that came a code that has irritated outsiders for as long as navies have existed. You do not discuss your shipmates ashore. Not the drinking, not the women, not the fear, not the man who wept, not the officer who froze. Whatever happens inside the hull stays inside the hull, and the man who breaks that is finished. Not punished exactly, but finished, in a way that no formal system needs to enforce. Parker absorbed that code at 19, in the coldest place he had ever been, at the age when a personality sets. He never let go of it. Not when a divorce court was picking his life apart. Not when a national press was offering him a fortune. Not for 44 years. Norway ended in retreat. The town was given up, the troops were taken off, and the men who had spent 2 months freezing to take it sailed south into a summer in which their country stood a genuine chance of losing the war outright. Parker survived it and went on serving. Destroyers, escort work, the grinding, unglamorous business of keeping ships moving while other ships tried to stop them. 2 years later, he was posted to the 27th Destroyer Flotilla, and in June of 1942, on a ship with an unhappy crew and a poor reputation, he was introduced to a 21-year-old sub-lieutenant with an English public school accent, a Greek title, and no country at all. The 27th Destroyer Flotilla was not a glamorous posting. It ran convoys up and down the east coast of Britain, the run from the Thames estuary north to the Firth of Forth and back, in weather that was reliably foul, and water that was shallow, mined, and within easy reach of German aircraft flying out of occupied Norway and the Low Countries. It was the sort of duty that produced very few medals and a great many dead men. The ships were mostly old. Several were older than the officers commanding them. HMS Wallace was one of these. She was a Thornycroft-type destroyer leader, laid down in the last year of the First World War, which made her roughly the same age as the men now serving in her, and she had the reputation that tends to attach to a tired ship on a thankless run. The reputation was not entirely about the hull. Ships acquire moods. A crew that has been doing a monotonous and dangerous job for a long time without recognition develops a particular sourness, and the sourness communicates itself to anyone who steps aboard. Wallace had it. In June 1942, into that atmosphere arrived two young officers who would later matter to each other more than either of them could have predicted. One was a 21-year-old Australian who had already been at Narvik. The other was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. It is worth stopping to consider what Philip actually was in that summer, stripped of everything the following 80 years attached to him. He was a first lieutenant's worth of experience in a sub-lieutenant's rank, aged 21, and he had been mentioned in dispatches for his handling of a searchlight at Cape Matapan the previous year, which is a genuinely impressive thing for a very young officer to have done under fire at night. He was also, in every practical sense, homeless. His family had been thrown out of Greece before he could form a memory of it. His father was living in the south of France with a companion and had effectively stopped being a father some years earlier. His mother had suffered a devastating breakdown, been institutionalized in Switzerland, and had by this point entered a religious life. His four sisters had married into German houses, which in the summer of 1942 was not a detail one raised casually in a British wardroom. His sister Cecilia and her family had been killed in a plane crash 5 years before. He had no money to speak of. He had no nationality that meant anything on a form. He had a title from a monarchy that had been abolished and restored so often that the word prince attached to him functioned less as status than as a slightly awkward biographical fact. What he had was a uniform, a job, and a demonstrated ability to do it well. Now consider what Parker was. 21. Australian, which in a Royal Navy wardroom in 1942 meant permanently and audibly foreign in a mild, tolerated, faintly comic way. The accent alone marked him out in every room he entered for the rest of his service. 6,000 miles from Melbourne, with no realistic prospect of seeing it again for years. A father and 3 brothers scattered across the same war. He had been away from home for 4 years by then, at an age when 4 years is a fifth of a life. 2 young men, both extremely capable at the work in front of them, both entirely detached from any place that would have counted as home. That is the whole foundation. Everything that follows in this story, the household, the tours, Kenya, Gibraltar, the 44 years of silence, rests on the fact that these two met before either of them was anything, in a setting that could not have cared less what they were supposed to be. The friendship formed fast, and it formed on the flat. This is the part that later became genuinely difficult for the British court to accommodate, and it is the reason the palace never entirely trusted Mike Parker. In 1942, there was no protocol between them. There was no bowing. There was a shared cabin culture, shared watches, shared bad food, and the specific black humor of men doing a monotonous, dangerous job in cold weather. Parker was funny. Philip was funny in the same sharp, unsentimental register. They recognized each other immediately, in the way that two people with the same defense mechanism generally do. They also recognized something less comfortable. Neither of them talked about the family situation. That was not the currency. But they were both, at bottom, young men who had learned early that the adults responsible for them were not going to be reliably present, and that the sensible response was to become extremely competent at something and let the competence do the work that belonging normally does. Parker had arrived at that by leaving. Philip had arrived at it by being left. The destination was the same. The war took them in different directions and then brought them back together. Philip served on Wallace, then moved on. Parker went where he was sent. By 1944, both were in the Far East, in the Pacific Theater, and the friendship deepened there, rather than lapsing, which is the useful test of these things. Wartime acquaintance is cheap and produces thousands of friendships that evaporate the moment the shooting stops. Theirs did not. By the end of the war, they had known each other 3 years and had the kind of understanding that requires no maintenance. Then peace arrived and posed each of them a question. Parker's question was ordinary. He was 25, married since 1943 to a young Englishwoman named Eileen Allen, and about to be demobilized into a civilian life he had never actually lived as an adult. He had joined at 18. He had no profession outside the Navy. He had a wife who had married an officer in wartime and did not yet know what she had married in peacetime, because neither did he. Philip's question was not ordinary at all. He was in love with the heir to the British throne, and there was a very reasonable prospect that he was going to be permitted to marry her. And when that happened, when the stateless young officer with the mentioned in dispatches and no country walked into the oldest and most heavily upholstered institution in Europe, he was going to need at least one person in the building who had known him before, who owed the palace nothing, and who could be relied upon to tell him the truth. He knew exactly who that was. There is a particular kind of marriage that only happens in wartime, and Britain produced hundreds of thousands of them between 1939 and 1945. The mechanism was simple. Two people met while one of them was on leave. The leave was short. The future was, in the most literal sense available, unknowable. Not in the vague way that everybody's future is unknowable, but in the specific way where one of the two people involved might be dead within the month, and both of them knew it. Under those conditions, the ordinary machinery of courtship, which is designed to take a year or two and to reveal incompatibilities slowly, simply stopped working. There was no year or two. There was a fortnight. So people married on a fortnight, and a very large number of them married strangers. Mike Parker and Eileen Allen married in 1943. He was 23. She was a young Englishwoman, and by the descriptions that survive of her, she was cultured in a quiet, unshowy, thoroughly English way. She liked the ballet. She liked opera. She liked the races. Newspapers later reached for a shorthand about twin sets and tweed skirts, which was condescending, and also not entirely inaccurate about the world she came from. Consider what she was actually marrying: an Australian, not an Englishman with a slightly odd accent, a genuine product of the other side of the planet, from a family she had almost certainly never met and would not meet for years, formed by a country she knew mainly as a place on a map that sent soldiers. He was loud where her people were quiet. He was direct where her people were oblique. He was extremely funny, and he had a physical confidence that a certain kind of Englishwoman found enormously attractive precisely because it was so unlike everything else in the room. He was also, in 1943, entirely defined by the Navy. That was the whole of him that she could see. The uniform, the leave, the going away, the coming back. She had no way of knowing which parts of the man were the man and which parts were the war, because there was no version of him available that had ever existed outside it. He was 23, and he did not know either. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Now, everything about the story that follows depends on getting this next point right, and most tellings do not bother. Eileen Parker is usually handled in one of 2 ways. Either she is a plot device, the wife whose divorce petition ends a man's career, appearing in the narrative for 1 paragraph in February 1957 and vanishing again. Or she is treated as an obstacle, the woman who could not cope with the demands of royal service and brought the whole thing down. Both of those are contemptible, and both are wrong. Here is what Eileen Parker actually married, without knowing she was marrying it. In 1947, 4 years into a marriage that had barely had a peacetime week to establish itself, her husband took a job in a royal household. He was appointed equerry-in-waiting to the Duke of Edinburgh, and then private secretary, at first, on a part-time basis, which is one of those phrases that has never once meant what it says. The job had no fixed hours. It had no season. It had no realistic boundary between working time and the rest of life, because the man he worked for was not a company. He was a person, and the person's life was the job. Where Philip went, Parker went. When Philip needed him at 11 at night, he was needed at 11 at night. When there was a tour, the tour lasted months. So Eileen, who had married a naval officer in a war, and reasonably expected the absences to end when the war did, discovered instead that she had married a man whose absences were now permanent, unpredictable, and unarguable, because they were in the service of the Crown, and there is no arguing with that in 1950s Britain. You cannot complain about it publicly. You cannot even complain about it at a dinner party. Your husband is doing something important for the royal family, and you are expected to be quietly proud and to manage. She had 2 small children in London. He was in Malta, He was in Canada. He was on a ship somewhere in the Southern Ocean. There is a version of that arrangement that works, and it usually requires two things: that the absent partner comes home genuinely present, and that the marriage had enough of a foundation to survive on memory. The Parkers had neither. He came home still half in the other life, full of it, telling stories about a world she was not part of. And the foundation was a fortnight in wartime. She was not weak. She was not failing to cope with something other women managed effortlessly. She was in an impossible position, and she was in it for a decade, and she was in it without a single person she could reasonably complain to. By the mid-1950s, that marriage was over in every way except the paperwork. It did not end because of one dramatic event. It ended the way these things almost always end, which is slowly, and mostly in silence, and with both parties still going through the observable motions long after the substance has gone. And when it finally came apart in public, when it detonated on a February morning in a way that took her husband's entire career with it, the country decided that the story was about a courtier and a prince and a rumor, and Eileen Parker's 10 years of holding a household together alone became a footnote in somebody else's scandal. She had every right to be furious. She was furious, and of the two of them, she was the one who eventually spoke. That is worth remembering when we get to the silence. But all of that is a decade away. In the autumn of 1947, none of it has happened yet. There is a young Australian officer with a wife and a future, and no particular idea what to do with peacetime. And there is a wedding coming at Westminster Abbey that will settle the question for him. On the 20th of November, 1947, Philip married Princess Elizabeth. And within weeks, Mike Parker walked through a door into the oldest household in Europe, wearing an accent that nobody in the building could place, and carrying a set of instincts formed at Narvik, and discovered that almost everyone he met there had already decided he was the wrong sort of man entirely. The British royal household in 1947 was not an organization, it was an ecosystem, and like all ecosystems, it had evolved over a very long time to reject anything that had not evolved alongside it. The men who staffed it came from a small and self-replenishing pool. Guards regiments, a handful of schools, families that had supplied courtiers to the same building for 3 or 4 generations, so that the name on a door in 1947 might have been on a similar door in 1897. They knew each other's brothers, they had married each other's cousins. They understood, without ever needing to state it, an enormously complex grammar of precedence. Who spoke first? Who wrote to whom? Which requests could be made directly, and which had to travel by a route so indirect that the request appeared to arrive of its own accord. None of this was written down. That was the entire point. A system that is written down can be learned by an outsider. A system carried in the bloodstream cannot. Into this, in the winter of 1947, walked a 27-year-old Australian who had spent the previous 9 years on warships. Parker's appointment was straightforward on paper. He became Equerry in waiting to the Duke of Edinburgh, and in time private secretary, initially part-time, which fooled nobody for long. He was also, formally, Equerry to the Duchess, which meant that from the beginning, his brief covered both halves of the new household. He had not applied. There had been no process. Philip had wanted him, and Philip had got him, and this was the first thing about Mike Parker that the household disliked. The second was everything else. Start with the voice. In a building where accent was the primary instrument of social measurement, Parker's was unplaceable, and therefore unrankable. He was not upper class, and he was not lower class. He was Australian, which sat outside the scale altogether, and forced everyone to make a decision about him that they would normally have made unconsciously in the first 4 seconds. Then the manner. Parker said what he meant. In a warship, this is a virtue and a safety requirement. In a court, it is close to a form of violence, because the entire apparatus is built on the ability to convey refusal, disapproval, warning and threat, without ever using a word that could be quoted. A man who simply states the problem has broken the machine. Worse, he has demonstrated, in front of everyone, that the machine was optional. Then, the method. Parker approached problems the way a destroyer officer approaches problems. Identify the objective. Identify the shortest route. remove obstacles, execute. The court approached problems by consultation, precedent, and the slow accumulation of consensus, a process explicitly designed to be slow because slowness prevents mistakes and, more importantly, prevents anyone being individually blamed for them. These two systems are not merely different, they are hostile to each other. A man who gets things done quickly makes visible the fact that everyone else has been getting things done slowly, and there is no institution on earth that forgives that. And then there was the real offense, the one underneath all the others. Mike Parker had a relationship with the Duke of Edinburgh that the household could not mediate. This is the thing to understand about why they wanted him gone, and it has nothing to do with his accent or his manners. Every other person in that building reached Philip through a channel. There were correct routes. There were people whose function was to know what Philip was thinking and to shape what reached him. That control was not a perk of the job, it was the job, and it was the source of every scrap of power any courtier possessed. Parker bypassed all of it, permanently, without effort, because he had known Philip on a destroyer in 1942, and the two of them had a shorthand nobody could get inside. He did not need to be told what Philip would think about something. He knew. He did not need to phrase a difficult truth carefully. He said it, and it was received, and there were no consequences, because the relationship predated every rule in the building. That made him unmanageable. Unmanageable people in a court are not disliked for their personalities. They are disliked because they represent a hole in the wall. There is one more element, and it is the one that made Parker essential, rather than merely irritating. Philip, in 1947, was in genuine trouble, and almost nobody in the household was on his side. He had arrived as a foreign prince with German brothers-in-law 2 years after a war against Germany. He had no money. He had given up his titles, his nationality, and his name in a series of transactions that were described as practical and felt like amputations. Senior courtiers regarded him as pushy. The queen, the future queen mother, was watchful. There were men in that building who had decided what Philip was before they had met him, and who never revised the judgment across the following 70 years. He was, in the room, largely alone. So the function Parker performed was not administrative. It was structural. He was the one person in the household whose loyalty ran to the man rather than to the institution, and everybody in the building understood that distinction perfectly, which is precisely why they distrusted him. Parker himself grasped this faster than people gave him credit for. He was not a naive colonial blundering about in a subtle world. He read the room accurately from early on. He simply declined to adapt to it, because adapting would have meant becoming another courtier, and then Philip would have had none of what he actually needed. So he made his choice in the first year, and it was the choice he kept making for a decade. He would be useful to Philip and unpopular with everyone else, and he would absorb the unpopularity personally rather than pass any of it upward. For 10 years, that arrangement held. It worked because it was never tested by anything that could reach him. Courtiers can disapprove of a man indefinitely without being able to remove him, so long as the man gives them nothing to use. In 1957, they would be handed something, not from inside the palace, from inside his own house. Before that, though, came the best years, the only stretch in which both men got something close to the life they had actually wanted. It lasted about 2.5 years, and it happened on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Malta in 1949 was a rock, a harbour, and the headquarters of the Mediterranean fleet. The island had been bombed nearly to pieces during the war. Valletta still carried the damage openly, collapsed facades, gaps in terraces where houses had been, limestone dust in the air that got into everything and turned the whole place the colour of weak tea. It was hot, it was crowded, it smelled of diesel and salt and cooking, and it was, for a very specific set of people, at a very specific moment, close to paradise. Philip was posted there as a serving naval officer, first lieutenant of HMS Chequers, and later, in 1950, his own command, HMS Magpie, a frigate, which is the thing every ambitious young officer in the world is working toward, and the thing he had every reason to expect was the beginning of a long career rather than the end of one. Elizabeth came out to join him. They stayed at the Villa Guardamangia, a rented house belonging to Lord Mountbatten. up a hill outside Valletta, and for stretches of 2.5 years, they lived something that resembled an ordinary life. Parker was there. Understand what those years actually gave each of the three of them, because it explains a great deal about what happened afterwards. For Philip, Malta was the last period of his life in which he was principally himself. He had a job with measurable outcomes. He had a ship. He was rated by his superiors on his competence and by his crew on his fairness, and both ratings were good. He was, in a hierarchy he respected, moving upward on merit. There is a detail from the Magpie period that people repeat because it captures him exactly. He drove that ship hard. Signals competitions, regattas, exercises. He wanted her to win things, and she did. It was the behavior of a man who had finally been handed something he could be measured on and was determined to be measured well. For Elizabeth, Malta gave her the only extended stretch of adult life she ever had, in which she was primarily a wife. She shopped, she went to the hairdresser, she sat in other officers' wives' houses and had conversations that did not involve the state. There was a rhythm to it. The fleet came in, the fleet went out, and in between there were dinners and picnics and swimming. She was in her early 20s. Her father was alive. Her children were small and in England, which is a complication we should not paper over. But the essential point stands. For 2.5 years, she was a naval officer's wife with an unusually complicated family, rather than the other way round. For Parker, Malta was the moment when the job made complete sense. The setting was naval. The instincts were the right instincts. He was running a household in an environment he understood perfectly, for two people who were happy, in a place where the British court could not easily reach any of them. There was no protocol war in Valletta. There was the fleet and the harbour and a life that had a shape. He would later describe those years in terms that made clear he knew exactly what they had been. Everybody who was there did. It was the good time, and everyone involved understood at the time that it was the good time, which is rarer than it sounds. Now the other thing that was happening, which nobody was looking at. Eileen Parker was in London. The children were small. The house was hers to run. Her husband was on an island in the Mediterranean, in the sunshine, working for a prince, in a life that from a distance looked like an extended and glamorous posting from which he showed no urgency about returning. This is where a marriage starts to fail, and it never announces itself. There is no argument, there is no incident, there is simply a slow divergence in which two people accumulate separate experiences at different speeds and stop being able to hand them to each other. Mike came home from Malta with stories. Eileen had no stories because she had been in London managing a household alone, and the honest account of her year, that it had been long and dull and lonely, and that she had been angry a great deal of the time and had not felt entitled to say so, was not a thing you could offer a returning husband in 1950 without it sounding like an accusation. So she did not offer it. And he did not ask, because he was 29 and delighted with his life and had no framework for the question. Meanwhile, the divergence widened in a way neither of them could see. He was becoming more and more indispensable to a man whose life was about to expand beyond all recognition, which meant that every year the job would demand more, not less. And underneath all of it, in London, the king was dying. George VI had been ill for a long time in the way that people were ill in that period, which is to say he was ill, and it was serious, and a great deal of energy went into ensuring that nobody said the word. He had part of a lung removed in 1951. The bulletins were reassuring. The reassurance persuaded the public and persuaded nobody who saw him regularly. The consequence for Malta was immediate and unarguable. Philip and Elizabeth were needed at home to take on the work the king could no longer do. In the summer of 1951, Philip gave up his command. He was 30 years old. He had been a serving officer since he was 18. He did not resign in any formal sense. It was described as indefinite leave, which was a courtesy everyone understood to be fictional. He never went back. Parker was there for it. He watched a man who had spent his entire adult life becoming excellent at one specific thing, put it down, walk off a ship, and get on an aeroplane to England, for reasons that had nothing to do with his own choices and could not be argued with. Nobody in Britain saw that moment. There was no photograph of it that meant anything. To the public, A prince came home to help his father-in-law, which is a pleasant and dutiful story. Mike Parker was one of a very small number of people who understood that something had ended. He would be standing beside him 7 months later when the rest of it was taken away too. Clarence House sits at the bottom of St. James's, a few hundred yards from the palace and entirely in its shadow, which is roughly the position its occupants held in 1951. The building had been done up for the young couple after the war, at considerable expense and with a great deal of public grumbling about it, and it functioned as the headquarters of a household that was, in constitutional terms, a rehearsal. Elizabeth was heir. Philip was the heir's husband. Neither of them held any position that carried authority, and both of them were now doing an enormous and increasing volume of the work that a dying king could not. Parker ran the door. That phrase covers more than it appears to. A private secretary at that level performs 4 separate jobs simultaneously, and it is worth setting them out, because the whole shape of what happened in 1957 depends on understanding what the man actually did all day. The first job is the diary, not the appointments themselves. A clerk can write those down, but the judgment underneath them. Which of the 400 organizations requesting a royal visit this year will get one? Which are respectable? Which have a political flavor that will cause a question in the Commons? Which are dying and would be saved by a visit? And which are already thriving and merely want the photograph? Somebody makes those calls. In that household, from 1947 onwards, it was largely Parker. The second job is paper. Everything that reaches a principal has been chosen by somebody. Every letter, every brief, every request, every warning. To control what a man reads is to shape what a man knows, and to shape what he knows is to shape what he decides. This is the quiet center of gravity in every private office in the world, and it is why the position is worth fighting over. The third job is the room. Who gets in? Who does not? Who is placed next to whom? Who is quietly not invited again after last time? A great deal of court warfare is conducted entirely through seating, and the fourth job, the one that has no description and cannot be delegated, is telling the man the truth. This is where Parker's value sat, and it is worth being exact about why, because it is easy to romanticize. Philip in 1951 was a 30-year-old man who had just given up the only career he had ever wanted, who had no constitutional function, who was surrounded by an institution that regarded him with suspicion, and whose wife was about to become the head of state. He was also, and every account of him agrees on this, a man of very considerable intelligence and a rather short fuse, who could dismantle a fool in a sentence, and frequently did. That combination produces a specific danger. Clever, frustrated men in powerless positions become surrounded, very quickly, by people who have learned that agreeing is cheaper than arguing. Nobody plans it. It simply happens, because the cost of contradicting him is high, and the cost of nodding is zero, and within a couple of years, the man is living inside a soft, warm, entirely sealed room, in which everything he says is a good idea. Parker was the hole in the room. He contradicted Philip. Regularly, casually, and without any apparent sense that he was doing something brave, because from where he stood he wasn't. He was talking to a bloke he'd shared a wardroom with. He could say, "That's rubbish," to the Duke of Edinburgh, and be right, and be told he was right, and the whole exchange would take 11 seconds and leave no residue. No other person in that household could do that. Not one. That is the actual job. Everything else was administration. It also produced the friction, and the friction became visible during the coronation planning, though it had been building for years. The clash that has survived in the record is the helicopter business. Parker was arranging for Philip to travel by helicopter to meet Commonwealth troops in the run-up to the coronation. Helicopters in 1952 and 1953 were a genuinely new technology, noisy, temperamental, and with a safety record that made cautious men uneasy. They were also, obviously, the future, and they solved a real problem, which was that the royal diary had expanded beyond what road and rail could physically service. Winston Churchill did not approve. The Prime Minister's objection was partly the machinery and partly something larger. Churchill had a deeply romantic conception of monarchy and its dignity, and he was not enthusiastic about the heir's husband clattering about the country in an experimental aircraft. Underneath that was the older question that hung over Philip's entire early career. What, exactly, is this man permitted to do, and who is deciding? Parker fought it. He fought a wartime prime minister on a question of transport arrangements, on behalf of a prince with no constitutional standing, and he did not conduct the fight with the elaborate deference the system expected. He was right about helicopters. Within a decade they were routine. Being right about helicopters did not help him. It confirmed everything the household already thought, that the Duke's Australian was pushing beyond his station, that he encouraged the Duke's worst instincts, and that he treated venerable institutions as obstacles to be routed around. They were not entirely wrong about that last part. That was precisely what he did. It was what he had been hired for. By the autumn of 1951, there were two consuming realities inside Clarence House, and only one of them was ever mentioned aloud. The one that was mentioned was the workload. Philip and Elizabeth went to Canada and the United States in October and November of that year, a major tour, standing in for the king. It went well. Philip was made a privy councillor. The one that was not mentioned was the king's condition. There is a detail from that Canadian tour that says everything. The private secretaries travelled with a sealed envelope containing the draft documents required in the event of the king's death. Accession papers, prepared in advance, carried across the Atlantic in a bag. Everyone in the office knew that envelope existed. Nobody discussed it. In January 1952, the king came to the airport to see his daughter off on the next tour. The photographs from that morning are unbearable in hindsight. A gaunt, hatless man standing on the tarmac in the cold, watching an aeroplane leave. They were bound for Kenya. Wheeler's was an oyster bar on Old Compton Street, in the middle of Soho, and on Thursdays at lunchtime it held a gathering that has been misdescribed for 70 years. The Thursday Club was not secret. It was not a society. It had no membership list worth the name, no rules, no premises of its own, and no purpose beyond lunch. A group of men met, ate oysters, drank a substantial amount, told stories, insulted each other with precision, and went back to work. That is the entire institution. The membership was the interesting part. It was deliberately, almost aggressively mixed. Actors, journalists, photographers, naval officers, a cartoonist or two. The sort of men who were good at a room and had done something demonstrable with their lives. It was assembled around the principle that a good lunch requires people who can talk, and that the ability to talk is distributed without any reference to birth. At the center of it was Baron Nahum, a society photographer, Anglo-Italian, immensely charming, a man with a foot in the aristocracy and both hands in Bohemia. He photographed royalty and he photographed dancers, and he moved between the two worlds with an ease that a great many people found suspicious precisely because it was so effortless. Parker was a member. Philip came. That last sentence has done a lot of work in a lot of books. Here is what the Thursday Club actually was. In the life of a 30-year-old man who had just given up his career, Philip in 1951 and 1952 had lost the only environment in which he had ever been comfortable. The Navy had given him a hierarchy that rewarded competence, a crew that judged him by his work, and a wardroom where he could say what he liked. All of it was gone. In its place he had a household that watched him, a press that photographed him, a court that outranked and mistrusted him, and a wife whose diary now governed both their lives. The Thursday Club was the substitute wardroom. That is not a euphemism, it is the literal function. A room, once a week, containing men who did not bow, did not defer, did not report, and did not treat him as a constitutional problem. He could be funny there. He could be rude there. He could say the wrong thing and have it come straight back at him across the table, rather than being received in respectful silence and then repeated in the palace by the evening. For a man in his position, that room was oxygen. Anyone who has ever held a public role that required constant self-monitoring will understand instantly why he went, and will find nothing remotely mysterious in it. Parker's role was to be the one who made it possible and the one who came along. He was the connective tissue between Philip and a normal social existence, which was the most valuable thing he provided, and, eventually, the most expensive. Now the other half of the picture, which is where honesty is required. The Thursday Club was a hard-drinking, all-male, thoroughly 1950s environment, and the humor was of its period. There were photographers and journalists in the room, and although the code of that era held, nothing said at Wheeler's on a Thursday appeared in print. A code is not a wall, it is an agreement, and agreements have a shelf life. Barron himself was a complicating factor. His social world was wide, and included people whose discretion was not guaranteed. His name later attached itself to episodes and inferences that had nothing to do with him directly, in the way that a well-connected man's name does, once the connections become interesting to strangers. And crucially, this was a room full of men whose wives were somewhere else. That is the detail that mattered, and it applied to Parker with particular force. Every Thursday lunch was another entry in a ledger that was quietly being kept in a house in London, where a woman with 2 children was noting, without saying anything, that her husband's absences had now extended from foreign tours to Thursday afternoons. So consider what was being assembled, entirely innocently, over the course of several years. A prince with no job and a well-documented need to escape his own life. A weekly gathering in Soho. Photographers and journalists in the room. Late lunches. A great deal of drink. An Australian private secretary who organized it, attended it, and was recognizably the Duke's closest friend. And a marriage in the background that was failing, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with any of it. None of that is a scandal. Every element of it is ordinary. But it is a complete set of components, and the British press in the 1950s was in the process of discovering that it no longer wished to be deferential. The old arrangement, the one that had kept Edward V's affair out of British newspapers for the better part of a year in 1936, was breaking down. It had been an arrangement between gentlemen, and the men now running newspapers were increasingly not that, and increasingly aware that the old restraint had made them look like fools while foreign papers sold copies. What they needed was a legitimate hook, a published fact that would let them print the surrounding material. They would get one in February 1957 from a divorce court, and when they did, every Thursday lunch, every foreign tour, every late night and every photograph of the Duke of Edinburgh laughing with his Australian friend would be pulled out of storage and relit, and none of it would be reported as lunch. There is one more thing worth saying now, so it does not have to be said later. Nobody has ever produced evidence of anything at the Thursday Club beyond what has been described here, not in 70 years, and not for want of extremely well-funded trying. Parker himself said one thing on the subject, late in life, and it was flat and unhedged, that his friend had been entirely faithful to his wife. The Queen's own private secretary, Lord Charteris, said there was no evidence of any kind to the contrary. The rumour survived anyway, because rumours do not need evidence. They need only a set of ingredients and a public that finds the story more entertaining than the alternative. The ingredients were fully assembled by the end of 1951. The match would be struck 5 years later. Before that, both men had 6 days left in the life they were living. On the 31st of January 1952, they boarded an aircraft at London Airport. They landed at Nairobi on the 1st of February, to the sort of welcome that colonial administrations were extremely good at producing. Crowds along the route, school children bussed to the airport and lined up with small Union flags on wooden sticks. A young princess in a light dress, moving down the row, saying the ordinary kind things that people remember for 60 years afterwards. One of those children later recalled the surprise when the couple walked straight over to where the school children were standing before attending to anyone else, which is a small thing, and also exactly the sort of small thing that made her career. Kenya in February 1952 was a colony under strain. The Mau Mau emergency was still months away from being declared, but the pressures that produced it were already in the ground. Land, settlement, and a settler population that had spent decades convincing itself the arrangement was permanent. None of this appears in the royal itinerary. The tour was designed as a Commonwealth progress, Kenya first, then Ceylon, Australia and New Zealand, several months in total. They had been given a house, Sagana Lodge, near Nyeri, on the slopes below Mount Kenya, presented as a wedding gift by the people of the colony. Wooden, comfortable, unpretentious. It sat in country that is genuinely beautiful, in a way that photographs consistently fail at. High, cool, green, with the mountains sitting in the distance, and the light doing something particular in the early morning. They had a few days of official engagements, and then the schedule opened up. On the 5th of February, the party drove to Treetops. Treetops was a peculiar and rather wonderful thing, a small lodge, built into the branches of an enormous fig tree above a waterhole in the Aberdare forest, put up in the 1930s by a former soldier called Eric Sherbrooke Walker for the entertainment of guests who wanted to watch big game without being part of it. It was reached by a ladder. It had a handful of rooms and no pretensions whatsoever. The party that climbed the ladder that afternoon was small: Elizabeth, Philip, Lady Pamela Mountbatten, her lady-in-waiting, and Philip's cousin, Mike Parker. A hunter named Jim Corbett was among those present, an old Indian tiger man then in his 70s, who had been engaged as an escort and who spent the night sitting on the stairs with a rifle across his knees. Below them, at the waterhole, elephant and rhino came and went in the dark. Elizabeth filmed. She was an enthusiastic amateur with a cine camera, and she used it constantly on that tour, and there is something almost unbearable about the footage from that night when you know what is coming. A 25-year-old woman, leaning over a rail in the dark, delighted, recording animals. Nobody slept much. That was rather the point. Toward dawn, she climbed to the lookout platform at the top to watch the light come up. Parker went with her. It is worth pausing here, because this is the last unremarkable hour of both their lives, and neither of them had any idea. The sun comes up fast on the equator. There is no long English dawn. The sky goes from grey to gold in a matter of minutes, and the forest below fills with noise as it happens. She had her camera. He stood beside her. An eagle came over. It hung there above them, riding whatever the air was doing over the trees, and they both watched it. Parker remembered that eagle for the rest of his life. He said later that he never thought anything of it at the time, that only afterwards, working backwards through the timings, did he realize that the moment they stood on that platform, watching a bird over the Aberdares, was, as near as anyone could calculate, the moment her father died at Sandringham. He was careful about it whenever he told it. He never claimed a premonition. He said only that he had not thought about it until later, which is the mark of a man reporting something rather than decorating it. The king died in his sleep in the early hours of the 6th of February at Sandringham, of a coronary thrombosis, aged 56. He had been out shooting the previous day. 6,000 miles away, his daughter came down the ladder in the morning as Queen of the United Kingdom and had no idea. Jim Corbett wrote a line in the Treetops Visitors book about it that has been quoted ever since, and it earns its fame, that for the first time in the history of the world, a young girl had climbed into a tree one day as a princess and come down from it the next day as a queen. She would not learn about it for hours. This is the part of the story that most accounts skip over quickly, and which is, in fact, the strangest thing about the whole day. The news left London immediately. It reached the British authorities in Kenya almost as fast. Ciphered telegrams were sent to the governor announcing the king's death, and could not be read, because the key to the cipher was somewhere else. That is not a legend. The most important message sent to that colony in 50 years arrived in a form nobody present could decode. So the machinery stopped. And while it was stopped, the news did what news does. It went round the world by radio, was carried on every wire service, and reached ordinary people in Nairobi, in Nyeri, in the shops and the bars and the newspaper offices, hours before it reached the woman it belonged to. Lady Pamela put it perfectly afterwards. They were, she said, the last people in the world to hear. The party had come back down from Treetops and returned to Sagana Lodge. It was a warm, ordinary afternoon. Elizabeth was at a desk, writing. In Nyeri, a few miles away, her private secretary, Martin Charteris, was having a drink in a restaurant when a journalist came over and mentioned, conversationally, the thing that everybody now knew. Charteris got into a car. At Sagana Lodge, Mike Parker was about to be handed the worst piece of information of his professional life and be given no instructions whatsoever about what to do with it. Charteris arrived at Sagana Lodge with something he could not confirm. That is the essential problem, and everything Parker did in the next few minutes follows from it. A journalist in a restaurant had told a private secretary that the King of England was dead. It was almost certainly true. It was also, at that moment, unverified. No telegram had come through, no official had rung, and the coded messages sitting undeciphered in a government office were of no use to anyone. You cannot tell a woman her father is dead on the strength of a remark in a bar. You also cannot wait, because the news was already loose in the world, and every minute that passed was a minute in which somebody might telephone the lodge, or a servant might hear it on a wireless in the kitchen, or a car might come up the drive with a stranger in it. Charteris found Parker outside and told him. The two men had a conversation that took perhaps 30 seconds, and consisted entirely of working out who was going to do what. Charteris did not go in. Parker did. The room was quiet. Philip was sitting with a newspaper. Elizabeth was at the desk on the far side, writing her letter, unhurried, in the middle of what she believed was an ordinary afternoon on the best holiday of her adult life. There was a wireless set against the wall. Parker's problem was geometry. To reach the wireless he had to cross her sightline, and the manner of a man crossing a room is legible. She would look up. She would see something in his face or his walk, and she would ask what was the matter, and he would then have to either lie to the heir to the throne, or tell her something he could not yet stand behind. So he went down onto the floor. He got onto his hands and knees, below the level of the desk, and he crawled across the room beneath her eyeline, and he reached up to the set and turned it on, with the volume already almost at nothing, and he put his ear close to it. The BBC Overseas Service. Then, the other frequencies. Slow music on all of them, the particular kind of music that is only ever broadcast for one reason, and which every adult in the empire had learned to recognize in 1936, when the same music had done the same job for the same family. He listened long enough to be certain, which did not take long. Then he stood up. He caught Philip's eye across the room, and moved his head toward the door, and Philip put down the newspaper and followed him out into the garden, and Mike Parker told his friend that the king was dead and that his wife was now queen. Parker described what happened next exactly once, in a sentence that has outlived every other thing he ever said in public. He said that Philip looked as though half the world had been dropped on him, and then, without any pause, he added the thing that people usually leave off when they quote it, that he had never in his life felt so sorry for anyone. Think about what those two sentences contain. They are the observations of a man who had been at Narvik at 19 and in the Pacific at 24, who had seen ships go down with men inside them, and who was now saying that the worst thing he had ever watched happen to a human being was a piece of news landing on a 30-year-old man standing in a garden in Kenya. Because Philip understood it instantly. That is what Parker was reporting. Not grief. The grief was real, and he had been genuinely fond of George VI, but grief was not what landed on him in that first second. What landed was the arithmetic. His wife was queen. His career, already suspended, was over permanently. His house, his diary, his name, his children's name, his standing in his own family, and every remaining hour of his life were now the property of an institution that did not much like him, and to which he could offer no argument at all. He was 30 years old, and the rest of it was decided. The Navy was gone. Malta was gone. The version of himself that had won signal competitions in a frigate 8 months earlier was gone. He got all of that in one go, standing on grass, and Mike Parker watched him get it. Then Philip went inside and asked his wife to come out into the garden, and the two of them walked, and he told her, "Nobody has ever recorded what was said out there, and nobody should try. The only two people present kept it, and it is the one royal conversation of the 20th century that has been left entirely alone. What happened afterwards is on the record, and is remarkable in a different way." Charteris saw her a short time later, seated at her desk in the lodge. He described her as completely composed, absolute master of her fate. His words, from a man who was not given to flattery and who had just watched a 25-year-old absorb the largest possible piece of news. There was work to do immediately. The party had to get home, documents had to be prepared, and there was a question that had to be asked at once and could not be softened, because the machinery of state needed the answer before the aircraft landed. Somebody asked her what name she wished to reign under. She said, "My own name, of course." They were out of Kenya within hours. The tour was abandoned where it stood. Somewhere in the luggage were the mourning clothes that travel with every royal party as a matter of routine, and which nobody ever expects to unpack. Mike Parker did the practical work of dismantling a 5-month tour in an afternoon, which is what he was for. And he had, by the time that aircraft lifted off, become the custodian of something. He had seen the exact moment a man's life was taken away from him. He had been the one who took it, in the sense that he was the one who said the words. He knew, better than the Queen did, better than the household did, better than the family did, what the crown had cost Philip, and what it was going to keep costing him. He was 31. He never told anyone, not for 44 years. The aircraft landed at London Airport on the 7th of February, and a young woman in black came down the steps into a country that had rearranged itself around her while she was in the air. Churchill was waiting on the tarmac. So were Attlee and Eden, and the rest of them, a line of elderly men in dark coats, hats off, in a cold English afternoon. Philip came down the steps behind her. That image is worth holding, because it is the first photograph of the new arrangement, and it is also, precisely, the arrangement. She goes first, he follows, and every camera in the country is pointed at the space in front of her. Within days the household had begun to reorganize itself, and the reorganization was not neutral. The Queen inherited her father's private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, universally known as Tommy, a man who had been managing British monarchs since the 1920s, who had watched Edward V walk out, and who had spent his entire professional life believing that the institution mattered more than any individual inside it, including the individual currently wearing the crown. Lascelles was extremely good at his job. He was also, by temperament and by conviction, exactly the wrong man to be enthusiastic about Prince Philip. Set the two households against each other, and you can see the collision coming from a long way off. On one side, the Queen's office, Lascelles, Charteris, men formed by the abdication, whose institutional memory contained a vivid and recent example of what happens when a monarch's personal life is allowed to shape the crown. On the other, the Duke's office, a 30-year-old with no constitutional role, a temper, a set of modernizing instincts, and an Australian private secretary, who thought the whole apparatus was inefficient, and said so. The Queen's household did not merely outrank the Duke's household. It absorbed most of the function. The first year of the reign settled a series of questions about Philip, and he lost nearly all of them. Where the family would live. He wanted to stay at Clarence House, which they had only just made their own. Churchill and the household were clear that the sovereign lives at Buckingham Palace, and to Buckingham Palace they went, into a building Philip described in later life, in terms that made his feelings about it unmistakable. Elizabeth had not wanted to move either. They moved. The name. The house would remain Windsor, not Mountbatten. Churchill was immovable. The Queen Mother was immovable. Lascelles handled the machinery, and the Queen accepted the advice she was given because it was constitutionally sound advice, and she was 3 months into her reign. Philip's reaction to that decision is one of the few places where his private bitterness reached the record, in the remark about being the only man in the country not permitted to give his name to his own children, his position at ceremonies, his precedence, whether he could see state papers. All of it was decided by other people. All of it was decided against him, and none of it could be appealed. And into every one of those defeats walked Mike Parker, whose job was now to build a functioning working life for a man who had been comprehensively stripped of one. This is the period in which Parker earned whatever anyone thought of him. He could not win the constitutional arguments. Nobody could. What he could do was find things for Philip to actually do. Real work, with measurable outcomes, in areas the palace had not thought to fence off. Industry, science, engineering, youth. The organizations that eventually became the Duke's life's work were being identified and approached in these years, and the approaching was done by a private office consisting of very few people, one of whom was an Australian ex-destroyer officer with no experience of any of it, and an enormous appetite for getting things moving. Which brings us to the helicopters. In the run-up to the coronation, the Duke's diary had expanded past the point where road and rail could service it. Britain in 1953 was a country of slow trains and slower roads. A day that required Philip in 3 places was a day that could not be constructed. Parker's solution was helicopters. The aircraft of that period were early, loud, and mechanically temperamental. They were also plainly the answer, and Parker set about arranging for the Duke to use them, including to reach Commonwealth troops assembling for the coronation. Churchill objected. The objection had 2 layers. The surface layer was safety, and it was not unreasonable. Rotorcraft in 1953 fell out of the sky more often than fixed-wing aircraft, and the Prime Minister had no appetite for explaining to the nation how the Queen's husband had been killed in a machine nobody had needed to put him in. The layer underneath was about dignity and about control. Churchill's monarchism was romantic and absolute. He had a picture in his head of what the crown looked like, and it involved carriages and cavalry, and a certain unhurried grandeur. A prince, clattering across England in a noisy experimental machine, because his diary was tight, did not fit the picture. Worse, it was an innovation nobody had authorized, arranged by a man nobody had appointed, on behalf of a figure with no standing to be innovating at all. Parker fought it. He went at a wartime prime minister over a transport arrangement, and he did not conduct the argument in the elaborately deferential register that the system required. He won, eventually and partially. Philip flew. Within a decade, the whole royal family was flying, and the argument looked as quaint as arguments about telephones. But the winning cost more than the win was worth. Every senior figure in that building now had a specific instance to point at. Not a vague feeling that the Australian was pushy, an actual episode in which Parker had gone up against Churchill and had been, infuriatingly, right. Being right is the least forgivable thing an outsider can do in an institution built on precedent. A man who is wrong can be corrected. A man who is right has demonstrated that the precedent was never load-bearing, and everyone who defended it looks smaller afterwards. From 1953 onward, Mike Parker was not simply the wrong sort of man in the household. He was the wrong sort of man who kept turning out to be correct. They needed him to hand them something. He would, in time, and it would come from a direction nobody in the palace had to lift a finger to arrange. The argument about whether to allow television cameras into Westminster Abbey was not really an argument about television. It was an argument about what a monarchy is for, and it was conducted with all the fury that people bring to a question they cannot state directly. The case against was made by nearly everyone who mattered. Churchill was against. Lascelles was against. The cabinet, initially, was against. The Archbishop of Canterbury had reservations. The Coronation Commission, chaired as it happened by Philip, inherited a position in which the ceremony would be broadcast on radio and filmed for later release, but not shown live inside the abbey itself, with the most sacred portions kept off camera entirely. The reasoning was sincere, and it was not stupid. A coronation is a religious act. The anointing in particular is the oldest and strangest thing in the entire British Constitution, a moment in which a person is smeared with consecrated oil under a canopy, out of sight, in a ritual inherited from the Old Testament by way of 1,000 years of muddled precedent. The argument was that a mystery observed ceases to be a mystery. Put a lens on it, and you convert a sacrament into a program, and once it is a program, it can be reviewed, and a thing that can be reviewed can be found wanting. There was also a practical fear, which was the fear of the ordinary. Millions of people watching in their own front rooms, with the fire on and the tea going cold, would see a young woman in heavy robes doing a very long ceremony, and some of them would be bored, and boredom is corrosive in a way that distance never is. The case for was made by a much smaller group, and Philip was at the front of it. His argument was blunt, and it was the argument he made about everything for the next 50 years. The monarchy does not survive by being hidden. It survives by being seen doing something that people find worth watching. A ceremony that the nation is excluded from is a ceremony the nation will eventually stop paying for. Television existed. It was going to be in every house within a decade, whether the palace approved or not. The choice was not between mystery and exposure, it was between exposure that the palace shaped and exposure that somebody else shaped. He was of course entirely right, and the pattern by now should be familiar. The Queen decided in favor of the cameras. The anointing itself remained unseen, which was the correct compromise and remained so. Everything else went out live. On the 2nd of June 1953, something in the region of 20 million people in Britain watched a coronation, most of them on sets belonging to somebody else. Neighbors, pubs, church halls, shops with a television in the window. Households that had never owned one bought one for the occasion. The event did more to put television into British homes than any commercial campaign of the period. And the monarchy did not shrink, it went the other way. The ritual, brought into the front room, attached itself to people's lives in a manner that pure distance had never managed. Parker was in the middle of the machinery for all of it. Philip chaired the commission, and the Duke's private office did the work that a chairman's office does. Arrangements, briefings, the endless management of people who wished to be consulted. Now the second half of this part, which is the half that matters to our story. In the same 18 months, Philip won that argument and lost the other one. The televising fight was a public, institutional question, and on public institutional questions he could occasionally prevail, because he had evidence and the future on his side. The other fight was about his family's name, and he lost it completely. The House of Windsor was confirmed in April 1952. His children would carry a name that was not his. It had been decided by Churchill and the Queen Mother and the constitutional machinery, and his wife had accepted the advice, because the advice was sound, and because she was new, and because the alternative was a political fight in the first months of a reign. The remark that survives from him about it, that he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children, has been quoted so often that it has worn smooth. Underneath the wit is something quite raw. It is not a complaint about protocol. It is a man saying that the one entirely ordinary form of paternity available to any labourer in Britain had been withheld from him specifically. He was 31. He had already surrendered his titles, his nationality, his religion of birth, and his career. The name was the last thing, and it went too. And here is the point at which Mike Parker becomes something more than a private secretary. Somebody watched him take that. Not the public. The public saw a young consort at a coronation, handsome, kneeling before his wife to pay homage, doing it perfectly. Not the household, who noted his temper and disliked it. Not the Queen, who loved him and had her own impossible position to hold, and could not be both his wife and the person who had ruled against him. Parker was in the building on the days when the decisions came down, and he was the one man there who had known Philip when he had nothing and had been happy anyway, and who could therefore measure exactly what was being removed. He also learned, in these months, the harder half of the job. There were things Philip said in private in that period which were not fit for repetition anywhere. The temper, the bitterness, the specific, personal, unfair things a proud man says about his in-laws and his wife's advisers when he has been beaten again and has nowhere to put it. Parker heard all of it, every word. That is the material, not affairs, not scandal, the ordinary, unglamorous, entirely human record of what a man says when he is humiliated and safe and talking to the one person who will not repeat it. It was worth a great deal of money later. It was worth a great deal of money almost immediately, if he had wanted it. He was 33 years old, and he was already carrying more than most people carry in a lifetime. And there was no arrangement, no oath, no contract, and no payment that obliged him to carry it. He carried it anyway. Between the coronation and the end of 1955, there is a stretch of about 30 months in which nothing dramatic happens and everything is decided. This is usually skipped. It contains no incident that a newspaper would have reported, and no scene that a drama would film. It is simply two households, the royal one and the Parker one, settling into arrangements that would prove, in one case, durable, and in the other, fatal. Start with the royal one, because it is the easier of the two. The Queen and Philip worked out a method. It was not announced, and it was probably never discussed in so many words, but by the mid-50s, The shape of it was clear to everyone who watched them at close range. He would not be given constitutional power, because there was none available to give. What he took instead was territory. Anything the palace was not already doing, he moved into: science, industry, engineering, conservation, sport, and above all the young. He built a working life out of the spaces nobody else had claimed, and he built it fast, and within a few years, the volume of it was such that it could not be dismissed. Inside the marriage, the arrangement was different, and it was the one that mattered. She would not be flattered by him. That was his function, and both of them understood it as a function. Everyone else in that building had a professional interest in agreeing with the Queen. He did not. He told her when a speech was dull, when a plan was foolish, when a person was a fool. She could be irritated by it, and frequently was, and she never once removed the privilege, because she had worked out early that a sovereign who is never contradicted stops being able to think. That arrangement held for 69 years. It is, in the end, the whole reason the marriage worked. Now the other household. The Parkers were living, by the mid-50s, in a marriage that had ceased to have a center. It is important to describe this precisely, because it did not fail in a way that anybody could point at. There was no crisis, there was no discovered letter, there was a slow, entirely predictable accumulation of the thing that kills more marriages than infidelity ever has, which is a difference in the size of two people's lives. Mike's life had become enormous. He was in the middle of the most watched household in the world, at a historically extraordinary moment, working 18-hour days on problems that were genuinely interesting, in the company of a man he loved, and a widening circle of people who found him excellent value. He was 35, and he was at the center of things. Eileen's life had become small, in the specific way that a life becomes small when somebody else's expands into all the available space. She had 2 children in London. She had a house to run on a private secretary's salary, which was not generous. She had a husband who was frequently abroad and, when at home, was often out, the office, the dinners, Thursdays in Soho, and who came back full of a world she was not in. And she had, above all, no permitted complaint. This is the part that people fail to feel properly. In Britain in 1954, if your husband worked for the royal family, you were the beneficiary of an enormous social good fortune, and everybody told you so. Neighbors were impressed. Relatives asked questions. There was no acceptable form of words in which a woman in her position could say that she was lonely and angry, and that the arrangement was eating her life, because the only available reply was that she should count herself lucky. So she said nothing, for years, and the nothing did what nothing does. Give her the credit she is owed. She did not leave when it would have been easy. She held the household together across the accession, the coronation, and the years of tours. She raised 2 children largely alone. She did the job that thousands of service wives and courtiers' wives did in that period, and she did it without recognition, without payment, and without the option of resigning. By 1955 or so, both of them knew. Neither said it. There is a specific cruelty in the arithmetic here, and it is the engine of everything that follows. The better Mike Parker did his job, the more certainly his marriage would end. Those 2 things were the same thing. He could not be the man Philip needed, available, mobile, permanently on call, always in the room, and also be a husband in any recognizable sense. The role required a man with no other life, and he did not have the sort of nature that could hold something back in reserve. He chose, not once, in a moment of drama, but 100 times, in small, unremarkable decisions across 10 years, and every one of them went the same way. And here is the thing that the tabloids would never afterwards report, because it is undramatic, and it complicates the story. He was not choosing Philip over Eileen out of glamour. There was very little glamour in it by 1955. It was mostly airports, paperwork, and other people's schedules. He was doing it because he had formed, at 19, in the Arctic, a conviction that certain people are yours, and you do not put them down, and because he had watched a man in a garden in Kenya lose everything, and had understood that the man now had almost nobody. It was loyalty. It was also, viewed from a kitchen in London, indistinguishable from abandonment. Both descriptions are accurate. That is what makes it a tragedy rather than a scandal. In the autumn of 1956, the arrangement received the final push it needed. A tour was announced. Not a normal tour, an extended voyage aboard the new royal yacht Britannia, taking the Duke of Edinburgh to open the Olympic Games in Melbourne, and then onward, through the Southern Ocean, to the Antarctic, the Falklands, and a string of small remote territories that no member of the royal family had ever visited. 4 months, the Queen was not going. Mike Parker went with him. Britannia sailed in the autumn of 1956, and for a while, it was the best thing that had happened to either of them in 5 years. The stated purpose was the Melbourne Olympics. Philip was to open the Games, the first held in the Southern Hemisphere, and a considerable moment for Australia, which had spent the post-war decade waiting to be treated as a country rather than a destination. From there, the itinerary went outward and downward, into waters where a royal visit had never happened, because no royal had ever been willing to spend that long getting there. Ceylon, Malaya, New Guinea, the Australian territories, then south, into the Antarctic proper, and on through the Falklands, South Georgia, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension, St. Helena, and the Gambia, places with populations in the hundreds, places where the arrival of a ship was the event of the decade. 4 months at sea, and the Queen was not aboard. That last fact was entirely unremarkable at the time, and became, within a few weeks, the only fact anybody was interested in. The reasons were straightforward. A sovereign cannot leave the country for 4 months. There were 2 small children at home, aged 8 and 6. There were state papers, audiences, and a prime minister who required weekly access. Philip was going because Philip could go and she could not, and because the visits genuinely mattered to the places receiving them. Now, what the tour actually was for the man at the center of it. Philip was back on a ship. Not commanding one, that was gone forever, but living in a wardroom culture, in a hull, at sea, on a long voyage with a defined purpose. He had been out of the Navy for 5 years by then, and 5 years of red carpets and civic receptions had not replaced what he had lost in Malta. Every account of that voyage describes a man visibly happier than he had been since the accession. He grew a beard, which delighted the press and horrified nobody who mattered. He got involved in the running of things. He organized entertainments. He put a great deal of energy into the Antarctic legs, which were the parts that interested him most: the ice, the science, the small British bases staffed by young men doing difficult work in impossible conditions, which was exactly his kind of thing. He also, for 4 months, was not the Queen's husband. He was the senior figure aboard, the person everything organized itself around, which had been his natural position in every environment he had ever thrived in, and had not been his position on land since 1952. Parker was beside him for all of it. And Parker was, if anything, having an even better time. This was his element completely. A ship, a long voyage, a complicated itinerary requiring constant improvisation, a wardroom full of men who found him hilarious, and no courtiers within 6,000 miles. There is no version of Mike Parker's life better suited to Mike Parker than the Britannia tour of 1956. The photographs from it are the difficulty. 2 handsome men in their 30s, tanned, laughing, at the rail, in shirt sleeves, in the sun, having what is unmistakably a wonderful time, on a ship, without their wives, for 4 months. Nothing in those photographs is untoward. Every single one of them is exactly what it looks like. Colleagues on a long tour, enjoying themselves. But photographs do not carry context, and by December they were arriving in London at a rate of several a week, into a country that was cold, that had just been through Suez, and where a woman was spending Christmas at Sandringham without her husband. That is the moment the story began to assemble itself, not in the British press first. The British press was still, in 1956, largely holding the line about the private lives of the royal family. The material moved through the American papers, the continental papers, and then back into Britain by conversation, the same route the abdication story had taken 20 years earlier, and everybody in Fleet Street was old enough to remember how that had ended. The suggestion, never printed in Britain in so many words, was that the Duke of Edinburgh was staying away because he wanted to stay away, that the marriage was in difficulty, that the beard, the ship, the length of the tour, and the good time visible in every photograph were symptoms of a man in flight. And running alongside it, unspoken but doing all the real work, was the presence of Mike Parker, because the story required an explanation for the fun, and the explanation the world reached for was the oldest one available: a bad influence, the Australian, the Thursday club man, the friend who kept the Duke out late and away from home. All those lunches in Soho, all those years of being the one who arranged the escapes, now available to be reread as evidence of something. None of it was written down. It did not need to be. It was in the air by the turn of the year, and the men aboard Britannia were, for the second time in 5 years, among the last people to know. They were somewhere in the South Atlantic over Christmas. There was a broadcast, the Queen's, from Sandringham, and Philip's own message sent from the ship, in which the two of them spoke to the Commonwealth from opposite ends of the world, and the sheer distance in it was noticed by everyone who heard it. The voyage turned north in January. Gibraltar was the last stop. The Queen was to fly out and meet the yacht there, and they would come home together, which was itself an arrangement designed by somebody in London who had understood exactly what the photographs were doing. Mike Parker, on the way up the Atlantic, was writing to his wife. He did not know that Eileen had already been to see a solicitor. A rumor needs 3 things to become a story. It needs material, it needs an audience with an appetite, and it needs a legitimate hook, some published, quotable fact that lets a newspaper print everything around it without being sued. By January 1957, 2 of those 3 were fully in place. The material had been accumulating for a decade: Thursday lunches in Soho, a private secretary who was the Duke's closest friend and a foreigner, years of tours, a 4-month voyage with the wife left at home, a beard, photographs of 2 men in shirt sleeves laughing in the sun. The appetite was new, and it was the important development. Something had changed in the British press between 1936 and 1957, and the change had a name: Margaret. 2 years earlier, the country had spent months in a state of open obsession over Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, a royal woman, a divorced man, an unresolvable collision between love and the church. The papers had covered it exhaustively. There had been photographers outside houses. There had been front pages speculating about a royal person's private feelings in a manner that would have been unthinkable in 1936. And the world had not ended. The monarchy had not fallen. Circulation had gone up enormously. That was the lesson Fleet Street took out of 1955, and it was the correct lesson. The old restraint had never been a law. It had been a habit, maintained by a generation of proprietors and editors who thought of themselves as gentlemen, and that generation was being replaced by men who did not. There was also Suez. It is easy to underestimate what the autumn of 1956 did to Britain's opinion of its own establishment. The country had gone into Egypt, been publicly humiliated, and come out again, having discovered that it could no longer act without American permission. Eden was finished. He resigned in January 1957, broken in health and reputation. The deference that had held British institutions in place since the war had taken a serious blow, and the press, which had been lied to during the crisis, was in no mood to be reverent about anything. So, material and appetite. What was missing was the hook. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away, and traveling north, the 2 men at the center of it had no idea. This is worth sitting with, because it is the second time in 5 years that Mike Parker found himself in a situation where the entire world knew something before he did, and on both occasions, the delay was caused by distance rather than concealment. Britannia had wireless. They received news. But news is not the same as atmosphere, and what was happening in London was atmosphere. Dinner tables, clubs, newsrooms, telephone calls. It does not travel by cable. It is the sort of thing you have to be in a country to feel. There were signals, in retrospect, the tone of some correspondence, questions from officials that seemed slightly odd, an awareness in the household that the length of the tour had become a topic. The response from London was, in fact, a measure of how serious it had become. The arrangement for the Queen to fly out to Gibraltar and return home aboard the yacht with her husband was not sentimental. Somebody senior had looked at what was happening in the foreign press and had concluded that the country needed a photograph of the two of them arriving home together. That is a defensive maneuver. It tells you the palace was already worried in January. Now the hook arrived, and it came from the one direction nobody in the palace had to arrange, engineer, or even wish for. It came from a house in London, where a woman had finally run out of the capacity to hold a position she had never agreed to occupy. Eileen Parker had gone to a solicitor. Her reasons were entirely her own, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the royal family. Her marriage had been effectively over for years. Her husband had been absent for a decade, and was now absent for a further 4 months, and she had 2 children, and a life that had been organized around somebody else's employer for as long as she could remember. There was another woman involved, and her name would appear in the eventual decree. The petition was hers to make. She was entitled to make it. She had been entitled to make it for years, and had not. What she almost certainly did not calculate, because why would she, was the arithmetic that a national newspaper would perform the moment the papers were filed. Here is that arithmetic. A divorce petition is a legal document. Legal proceedings are reportable. The moment Eileen Parker's separation became a matter of record, every British newspaper acquired a lawful right to print the name Michael Parker and to explain who he was, which meant explaining his position, which meant explaining his closeness to the Duke of Edinburgh, which meant, and this is the whole mechanism, printing 4 months of accumulated foreign speculation as background. Nobody would have to allege anything about Philip. Nobody would have to write a single actionable word about the Queen's marriage. They would simply report a divorce, at length, with context. The hook had arrived, and it was perfect, and it was entirely accidental. In late January, the news reached the yacht that the story was breaking. Parker was told that his own marriage was about to be conducted in public, that his name would be in every paper in Britain within days, and that the coverage would not really be about him at all, that his divorce was going to be used as a doorway into the Queen's marriage. He had perhaps a week to think about it, somewhere in the Atlantic, on a ship, with the man whose life the story was actually aimed at sitting a few yards away. He worked out what he was going to do. On the 6th of February 1957, 5 years to the day since a warm afternoon in Kenya, Britannia came into Gibraltar. Gibraltar in February is grey and windy, and the rock does something particular to the light. It puts half the town in shadow for most of the day, and makes everything look provisional. Britannia came in, and the story was already there waiting. The date has to be said plainly, because it is the sort of coincidence that a scriptwriter would be told to cut. The 6th of February 1952, Mike Parker crawls across a floor in Kenya and tells his friend that everything is over. The 6th of February 1957, Mike Parker's own everything ends, on a quay, in the Mediterranean, 5 years to the day. He resigned. The manner of it matters more than the fact, and this is where nearly every popular account of Mike Parker gets the story exactly backwards. The version that has circulated for decades, and that was dramatized for a very large television audience, has Philip demanding his resignation. A prince protecting himself, cutting loose a friend who had become a liability, choosing the institution over the man. That is not what happened. Parker's own obituary in The Independent put it in a phrase worth borrowing. He quixotically decided to fall on his sword. Not was pushed, decided. Philip did not ask him to go. The palace, so far as the record shows, did not formally require it. Parker looked at the situation, understood the mechanism precisely, and removed himself from it, before anybody had to have a conversation about it. The reasoning was not complicated, and it was correct. As long as Michael Parker was private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh, every column inch about his divorce would be a column inch about the Duke of Edinburgh's household. His name, and Philip's name, would appear in the same paragraph in every newspaper in Britain for as long as the proceedings lasted, and the papers would use the proximity to print everything they could not otherwise print. The rumours about the royal marriage would ride into British newsprint on the back of the Parker divorce, because the Parker divorce was the only lawful vehicle available. Sever the connection, and you remove the vehicle. Not entirely, the story would still run, but you take away the daily, renewable, legally safe hook. So he resigned, and by resigning he made his own disgrace the whole of the story, rather than the doorway to a bigger one. Understand what that actually cost him. He was 36 years old. The job was not merely his employment, it was his entire adult identity outside the Navy, which he had also given up. He had no other profession. He had 2 children and a marriage in litigation, and no income after that morning. And he was walking away from the one thing that had never failed him since 1942, which was the daily company of the person he was closest to in the world. He was also, and he knew this too, walking away from any prospect of being publicly cleared. A man who resigns is a man who has something to resign about. The moment he stepped off that ship, the country would read the resignation as an admission, not of his own divorce, which was already public, but of the larger unspoken thing. He was accepting, deliberately, that he would be remembered as the man who had been quietly got rid of. He could have stayed and fought. He could have said, accurately, that his marriage had failed for reasons entirely unconnected to the Duke of Edinburgh, that 10 years of absences had done it, and that the rest was invention. Saying that would have required discussing the 10 years. It would have required explaining exactly what the job involved, what Philip's life was actually like, what had been demanded, and why. It would have meant defending himself by describing his friend's circumstances in public. He did not do it, not that week, not that year, not once in the following 4 decades. There is a photograph from that morning, taken by a Daily Mirror photographer called Frank Woods, and it is one of the more affecting pictures in the whole royal record, precisely because nothing is happening in it. 2 men standing in Gibraltar. One is the Duke of Edinburgh, the other is his private secretary, who has just resigned. They are dressed for the weather, they are talking, or have just stopped talking. 15 years of friendship, a war, a wedding, a coronation, an accession, and a floor in Kenya, and it ends with 2 men on a quay, in an ordinary conversation that neither of them wanted to be having, in front of a photographer. Shortly afterwards they said goodbye and went in different directions. Philip stayed with the yacht. The Queen was flying out. The plan required the 2 of them to come home together, publicly, calmly, in front of cameras, to demonstrate to the country that there was nothing to demonstrate. Parker went to the airport, alone, to fly to London. There is one more thing about that morning that the record preserves, and it is the detail that tells you what Philip actually thought about all of it, as against what he was later accused of thinking. Parker was made a commander of the Royal Victorian Order. The Royal Victorian Order is the sovereign's personal gift. It is not awarded on ministerial advice. It exists precisely and only to recognize personal service to the monarch, and it is bestowed at the sovereign's own discretion. On his way out, resigning in the middle of a scandal, at the exact moment when a household protecting itself would be doing everything possible to establish distance, Michael Parker was given a personal honor by the Crown. That is not what disposal looks like. It is a message, sent in the only language a palace has, and it was legible to everyone who understood the language. Whatever the newspapers were about to do to this man, the family he had served did not accept the story. The newspapers did not care. He landed in London that evening, and they were waiting for him. There were reporters at the airport, and there were reporters outside his house, and there were reporters ringing everybody who had ever known him. This was not the routine attention that a courtier's divorce would ordinarily attract, which is to say none at all. It was a proper Fleet Street operation, the kind that gets mounted perhaps twice a year, and it was mounted because every news editor in London had arrived at the same conclusion at the same moment. This is the way in. The reporting itself was, in the narrow sense, accurate. A private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh had resigned. His wife had filed for separation. He had returned from a 4-month tour. Each of those facts was true, and each was lawfully printable. It was the arrangement of them that did the work. A story that puts those 3 facts in that order, and then adds several paragraphs describing the Duke's 4 months at sea, the beard, the photographs, the absence of the Queen, and the general question of what everybody in Europe had been saying since December, does not need to make an allegation. The reader makes it. The paper has printed nothing but verifiable fact, and has nonetheless delivered a suggestion that would have been ruinous to print directly. That technique was not invented in 1957, and it has not been improved on since. Within days, the pressure reached a level that produced something genuinely extraordinary, and it is the fact that tells you how serious the situation had become. Buckingham Palace issued a public denial. The palace does not do this. The institutional doctrine, then and now, is that comment dignifies the rumor and that silence outlasts it. The last comparable moment had been in 1936, and everyone remembered how well that had worked out. But by mid-February, the rumor of a rift between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh was running in newspapers on 3 continents, and the palace concluded that the doctrine had to be broken. A statement went out saying, in the flat language such statements use, that it was quite untrue that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke. Nobody in Britain had printed the allegation. The palace was denying something that, officially, had never been said. That is what it looks like when an institution has been outmaneuvered. The denial confirmed to every reader in the country that the thing existed to be denied, and it moved the story from foreign speculation to domestic fact overnight. Fleet Street could now report the denial, and reporting a denial requires stating what is being denied. Meanwhile, there was an actual man in an actual house in London with 2 actual children. Mike Parker's situation in February 1957 was as follows. He had no job, he had no income, his marriage was in the hands of solicitors, his name was on the front of every newspaper in the country, photographers were outside. His children were of an age to be asked about it at school, and the story being told about him was not the story of his marriage, which was real and painful and his own, but a story in which he featured as the bad influence in somebody else's, based on nothing. He had one thing available to him that would have changed all of it in an afternoon. He could talk, not sell secrets, he did not need to. He needed only to explain himself. He could have laid out, calmly and truthfully, what the job had actually involved for 10 years. The hours, the absences, the impossible demands, the reason a marriage does not survive it. Every word of that would have been accurate, and it would have been sympathetic, and it would have shifted the coverage from disgraced courtier to man broken by royal service. The trouble is that the explanation could not be given without describing Philip. You cannot explain why you were never home without explaining what you were doing and who you were doing it for. You cannot describe 10 years of absences without describing the man whose life created them. Every honest sentence in Mike Parker's own defense would have been a sentence about the Duke of Edinburgh's private life, delivered to a press pack that had assembled specifically to obtain sentences about the Duke of Edinburgh's private life. There was no version of self-defense available to him that did not feed the thing he had resigned to starve. So he said nothing. He gave the reporters a courteous non-answer, and he went inside, and he kept doing that until they got bored, and they got bored eventually, because mobs always do. There is a particular quality to that decision which is worth naming, because it was not a single heroic moment. It was a decision he had to make over and over, every day, for weeks, in a house with the curtains shut, while being described in print as something he was not, with a perfectly good answer sitting in his mouth. Anyone can be brave once. Being brave every morning for a month, while nothing improves, is a different thing entirely. The divorce proceeded through the courts and concluded the following year. The decree was granted in 1958 on the ground of his adultery with a named woman. That is the fact, and it should not be softened. He had been unfaithful. Eileen's petition was justified. She had every right to bring it, and she brought it after a decade of holding a position that would have broken most people, and the fault in that marriage was substantially his. What was not true was the thing the country actually believed, which was that Michael Parker had somehow led the Queen's husband astray, and that his removal had been a palace clean-up operation. He was guilty of the smaller thing. He was convicted, in the only court that mattered, of the larger one, and he let it stand. The press moved on. By the summer the story was cold, as stories are. The Queen and the Duke were photographed together constantly, and the rumors subsided into the permanent low hum that has surrounded that marriage ever since. Mike Parker was 37, unemployed, and finished in Britain. He went home. Not to the house, to the country. Divorce in Britain in 1958 was a fault-based system, and the fault had to be somebody's. There was no such thing as an irretrievable breakdown recognized in law. There was no arrangement by which two people could agree that a marriage had ended and go their separate ways with the state's blessing. Somebody had to have done something, and that something had to be proved in open court, and the proceedings were reportable. So the machinery required a guilty party, and in the Parker case, the guilty party was Mike. The decree was granted in 1958 on the ground of adultery, with a woman named in the papers. That is the fact. He was unfaithful. Whatever else this story contains, it does not contain an argument that he was wronged in his own marriage, and anyone telling it that way is telling it dishonestly. But the system had a peculiar effect, and the effect is central to what happened to his name. A fault-based divorce produces a legal document that says one thing about a marriage, and it says it with the authority of a court. The document does not say that a woman spent 10 years alone with 2 children while her husband served a royal household. It does not say that the absences were structural rather than chosen, or that both people had married a stranger in wartime, or that the whole thing had been dead for years before anybody consulted a solicitor. It says, adultery. Petition granted. So the record now contained a single clean sentence about Michael Parker, and every newspaper reporting it had already spent a year attaching that sentence to a much larger and entirely unproven story about the Queen's marriage. The two things fused. They have never separated since. Eileen deserves the last full accounting here, because after this she leaves the narrative, and she should not leave it as a device. She had been 20-something when she married a man she barely knew, in a war, on the reasonable assumption that peace would let her find out who he was. Peace arrived and took him further away than the war had. She held a household together for a decade, in reduced circumstances, while being expected to feel fortunate. She raised 2 children largely alone. She endured absences she had not consented to, and could not object to, and when she finally did the one thing available to her, the entire British press turned her private catastrophe into raw material for a story about somebody else's marriage. She was not a footnote. She was the person in that triangle with the fewest options and the least protection, and she used the only remedy the law gave her. She also, and this is the detail that gives the whole story its final shape, eventually told her side. Years later, she wrote about those years, about what royal service had done to her marriage and her life. She talked. He never did. Neither of those choices was wrong. Hers was the choice of a woman who had been silenced for a decade and had earned the right to speak. His was the choice of a man who had decided that his own defense would cost somebody else too much. What is worth noticing is that they were both, in their way, describing the same thing, an institution that consumes the private lives of the people who serve it and offers nothing in return but the assumption that they should be grateful. Now the practical position of a 38-year-old man in London in 1958. He was, in employment terms, radioactive. Consider what he had on paper. 10 years as private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh, the most impressive line on any curriculum vitae in Britain, and completely unusable. Any employer looking at it would think, immediately and inevitably, about the divorce, the resignation, and the rumours. He was not a man with a distinguished record. He was the man from the story. Worse, the qualities that made him good were the qualities nobody could verify. Discretion is invisible. Judgment is invisible. His entire professional value consisted of things that by definition left no evidence, and the one visible thing in his file was a scandal. There was also the standing offer, and it never went away. He could have written a book. In 1958, a memoir by the Duke of Edinburgh's former private secretary, the man who had been there for the accession, the coronation, Malta, the Thursday Club, 4 months on Britannia, would have been the publishing event of the decade. There was serious money available. There would have been serialization, which in the newspaper economics of that period meant a sum that could resolve a man's finances permanently. He would not have had to invent anything. He would not even have had to be malicious. A straight, honest account of his 10 years, written well, would have made him wealthy and would have devastated the household he had left. He did not write it. Not in 1958, when he badly needed the money, and not later, when the offers improved. So he went home. He returned to Australia, to Melbourne. the city he had left in 1938 as an 18-year-old going to a war, and to which he now came back at 38 as a divorced man whose name had been in every British newspaper for reasons he had not explained, 20 years away, his parents older, his brothers with their own lives, a country that had changed considerably and that regarded the British court by 1958 with rather less reverence than it had when he left. He went into business, commercial work, in Australia and in Europe, of the ordinary kind that does not attract attention. He married again in 1962 and again in 1976, and had 4 children in total across his life. That is the shape of the second half. It is much quieter than the first, and it is not a decline. He was not a broken man drinking in a corner. He built a working life, and it lasted 40 years, and it was his own. But the thing that defines him was not any of it. The thing that defines him is what did not happen across those 4 decades. And to see it, you have to look at what he kept doing instead, quietly, privately, without a single person in Britain knowing about it. The letters never stopped. Australia in 1958 was in the middle of the best economic decade it had ever had, and it had stopped waiting for London's approval. The country Mike Parker came back to was not the country he had left. Melbourne had just hosted an Olympic Games. Migration from Europe had changed the streets, the food, the accents, the churches. The post-war boom was in full flow, houses going up in every direction, full employment, a confidence that had not existed in the 1930s. And the relationship with Britain had quietly altered. Suez had done some of it. So had the war in the Pacific, where Australia had discovered in 1942 that when the crisis came, its security depended on Washington rather than London. The affection for the crown was still real, and would remain real for decades. The Queen's 1954 tour had drawn crowds of a scale that has never been repeated anywhere, but the deference was thinning, which meant that a man arriving from England with a scandal attached found, to his considerable good fortune, that Australia was not enormously interested. The story had run in the Australian papers, of course. He was Australian. That was the local angle. But it was a British story about British royalty and British newspapers, and once it stopped running, the country moved on to its own concerns, of which there were plenty. This is the thing that made the second half of his life possible. In Britain he was permanently the man from 1957. In Australia he was a Melbourne man, from a good naval family, who had been away a long time and had a complicated period behind him. He went into commercial life. Business interests in Australia and Europe. The record on this is thin because there was nothing to report. This was the ordinary work of a capable man in his 40s and 50s who had contacts, energy, and a considerable gift for getting on with people. That last quality was never damaged. Every account of Mike Parker in later life describes the same person the wardroom had described in 1942. Funny, direct, excellent company, entirely without pomposity. Whatever the previous decade had cost him, it had not made him bitter, which is genuinely unusual and worth noting. He married again in 1962, and that marriage ended too. He married a third time, in 1976, to Jean Ramsey, and that one lasted the rest of his life. He had 4 children across the 3 marriages. He was, in later years, active in things that suited him: service associations, the naval world, the ordinary civic furniture of a man with a long service background. He was appointed a member of the Order of Australia, which is the recognition of a country for a citizen who has been useful in it, and which sits rather nicely alongside the CVO he had been given on a quay in Gibraltar. That is a complete life. Most people would settle for it. Now the other track, running simultaneously, invisible to everyone. 6,000 miles away, a version of Mike Parker was being written that had almost nothing to do with the man in Melbourne. Every book about Prince Philip needed a chapter on 1957. Every book about the Queen's marriage needed to address the rift rumors. Every author who took on that period reached for the same convenient shape, because the shape was already there, and it required no research. The Australian Equerry, the Thursday Club, the bad influence, the divorce, the discreet removal. The shape hardened through repetition. A claim in one book became a citation in the next, and an established fact in the third. By the 1970s it was simply what people knew. By the 1990s it was a fixture. When television drama got hold of the period decades later, it inherited the same shape and made it visual, and gave it to a global audience, including the scene in which Philip demands his resignation, which did not happen, and which his own children have objected to. He was alive for most of that. He read it, or was told about it. He never corrected any of it in public. But something else was happening, entirely privately, and this is the part that no one in Britain saw. The friendship never stopped, not paused, not resumed later after a decent interval. Never stopped, from 1942 until 2001, very nearly 60 years, of which 44 came after the resignation. The letters went back and forth. Parker came to Britain and saw him. Philip's own correspondence habits were prodigious. He was a writer of letters all his life, and Mike Parker was on that list from the beginning to the end. When Parker was in London, there were meetings. When there were family occasions where his presence was appropriate, he was there. The palace did not object. The Queen did not object. The children knew who he was. Think about what that means as a piece of evidence, because it is the strongest evidence in this entire story, and it is not testimony from anybody. If the popular version were true, if Mike Parker had been a corrupting influence quietly disposed of by a household protecting itself, the relationship would have ended in 1957. That is what disposal means. There would have been a formal courtesy and then nothing, which is exactly what happens to courtiers who are genuinely got rid of, and there are plenty of examples. Instead, a CVO on the way out, and then 44 years of unbroken personal contact with a man whose time was among the most rationed in the world. Philip did not keep up friendships out of guilt. It was not in his character. He was famously impatient with sentiment, and had no difficulty dropping people who bored him. He kept up with Mike Parker for 44 years because he wanted to, which tells you what he thought of what had happened. And on the other side, Parker was in possession of everything. Every year that passed, the value of what he could sell went up. The Duke became more famous. The marriage became more scrutinized. The market for royal revelation expanded enormously through the 1980s and 1990s, into an era in which a former royal servant could name a price and get it. He was in Australia, financially ordinary, with a story worth a fortune, and with a public reputation that a book would have corrected overnight. 44 years. He said one thing in all that time: silence is only interesting if it costs something. A man who says nothing because he has nothing to say is not admirable. He is merely quiet. Silence becomes a subject worth studying only when the man staying quiet had, at every point along the way, something enormous to say, a market willing to pay a fortune for it, and 44 years in which to change his mind. Mike Parker never changed his mind. So it is worth setting out, with some precision, exactly what he was declining, year after year, for 4 decades. Not in the vague, admiring way obituaries do it. He never spoke of his royal years, but item by item, the way you would price an estate. Because until you know what the silence was actually worth, you cannot understand what it cost him to keep it. He had been present at the accession, not near it, in the room, on the floor, at the radio. He was one of a handful of people alive who could describe what the 6th of February 1952 had actually looked like from inside, and the only one of them who was neither a member of the royal family nor bound by the discretion of a lifelong courtier's career. Picture the geography of it properly, because the geography is the whole story. Sagana Lodge sits in the central Kenyan highlands, a wedding present from the nation to a young couple who had come out to stand in for the king on a Commonwealth tour, because George VI's lungs would no longer let him make the journey himself. The plan had them travelling on to Australia and New Zealand afterward. Nobody in that party expected to be doing anything on the 6th of February except watching elephants from a tree platform at a place called Treetops, which is where they had spent the previous night, high above a waterhole, cameras ready, entirely unaware that 70 miles away, at Sandringham, an already ailing king had died quietly in his sleep. The news reached Kenya the way news reached remote colonial outposts in 1952, badly, and late, and through a chain of people, none of whom wanted to be the one holding it. A journalist heard first. Martin Charteris, the princess's private secretary, had to establish that a wire service report was true before anyone could act on it, because you do not tell a woman her father is dead on the strength of a rumor. He drove from the town of Nyeri toward the lodge with the confirmation in hand, and it is Charteris who is remembered for the line he used in a coded cable to London, that the hyena, code for the operation confirming the king's death, had come home to roost. Grim, and very English, and entirely functional, it let the machinery in London start moving before anyone had to say the actual words out loud on an open line. Mike Parker was already at Sagana Lodge with Philip. And this is where the story earns the image. Everything else in this account is built around. The lodge had a wireless. Parker was the one who heard, first, the confirmation coming through, and he did not walk into the room and announce it. He got down and crawled, below the sightline of a desk, toward the set, so that the young woman sitting at that desk, writing an ordinary letter to her father, would not glance up and read the news off his face before anyone had decided how, or when, or by whom, she should be told. He told Philip privately. It was Philip who told her, and it is Philip, by every account that has ever surfaced, who then took his wife out into the garden and walked with her for a while, before either of them went back inside to become, formally, a different pair of people than the two who had walked out. Parker described this once, on the record, decades later, the look on his friend's face in that garden, the sense of a weight arriving with no ceremony and no warning. Half the world dropped on a man in the space of a single sentence. It is one of the only pieces of the private record he ever surrendered, and he surrendered it because it was, in the end, a story about a historic day and not a story about a marriage. That distinction mattered to him more than it has ever mattered to anyone paying for a serialization. He had been in the household through the constitutional fights of 1952 and 1953 too, and these were not minor administrative squabbles, whatever their dry names suggest. The question of the family name was, underneath the procedure, a question about whether Philip would be permitted to give his own children his own surname, or whether the House of Windsor would simply absorb him, as it had absorbed every other man who married into it, leaving no trace of him in the record his own sons would carry forward. Churchill's government, backed by an old guard suspicious of a foreign-born prince with a reputation for bluntness, decided against him. The name stayed Windsor. Philip is reported, by people who were in a position to hear it, to have said that he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his children his own name, said it with the particular flatness of a man who has already lost the argument and is now simply describing the loss for the record. Where he lived, what he was called, what he was permitted to sit near at his own wife's coronation, whether he would kneel or merely bow, every one of these questions was fought and lost across those 2 years, and every one of them was fought in rooms Mike Parker had access to, and discussed afterward, in a private study, by a man who did not, as a rule, let anyone watch him lose. Parker watched him lose, repeatedly, and said nothing about any of it in public for the rest of his life, beyond the barest procedural facts that were public record anyway. He had been at the Thursday Club for the better part of a decade, a lunch club that met, appropriately, on Thursdays, upstairs at Wheeler's restaurant in Soho, and that has passed into royal folklore as a byword for a certain post-war bachelor culture that the palace would very much have preferred nobody wrote down. The membership was a mixture that could not exist today without a press agent standing outside the door. Actors, cartoonists, journalists who had agreed, as the price of admission, to print nothing. The photographer Baron Nahum, whose flat doubled as an unofficial clubhouse. Men who had flown in the war, and men who told very good stories about having flown in the war, and, at the center of it whenever his schedule allowed, Prince Philip, drinking, laughing, and, this is the part that made the room dangerous, talking. Nobody who has ever written seriously about that period disputes that unguarded things were said in that room, across a decade, by a man who was, by 1957, second in precedence in the entire United Kingdom. Mike Parker heard all of it. He knew who drank past the point of discretion, who repeated things he shouldn't have the following week, whose marriage was already in trouble before it became a newspaper's business, and precisely how much of what later got attributed to a friend of the Duke's, in the press, over the following 50 years, traced back, however indirectly, to a room above a Soho restaurant that no longer exists. He never named a single person in it, not the famous ones, not the disgraced ones, not the ones who later denied ever having been there at all. He had been aboard Britannia for 4 months in 1956, which is to say he had personally experienced, at close range and for an extended period, the exact thing the entire world had spent the following year speculating about. The royal yacht left in October 1956 on what was billed as a tour of Commonwealth outposts, the Melbourne Olympics closing ceremonies among the official stops, and did not return until February 1957. 4 months. No wife aboard. A crew, a small circle of friends including Parker, and an itinerary that ranged across some of the more remote parts of the Commonwealth, filed by a press corps back in London that had almost nothing to report, and, by the empty months in the middle of that gap, began simply inventing what it could not confirm. A specific and specifically unfounded story began circulating that winter, that the marriage was in trouble, that there was another woman, that the Duke would not be returning to a normal domestic life at all. The rumor had a name attached to it, a private secretary's wife, entirely without evidence, and it did more lasting damage to that innocent woman's life than to anyone actually aboard the yacht. Parker was there for the whole of it. He could have confirmed the theory, in a single sentence, if it had been true. He could have killed it, in a single sentence, given what he actually knew. He did neither, in public, for the rest of his life, though privately, decades on, he did finally close the door on it, which is the part of this story everything is building toward. And then there is the detail that turned Parker from a footnote into a story in his own right. The tour had barely ended, in February 1957, when his own marriage collapsed into a very public and very unwelcome divorce, cited by name in a press that had been starving for 4 months, and finally had something with a royal adjacency it could print without restraint. He resigned his post within days, under direct pressure, because a divorced man standing at the shoulder of the monarch's husband was, in the moral arithmetic of the 1950s palace, no longer employable there regardless of the facts of the marriage's failure. He left England not long afterward for Australia, the country of his birth, and did not return to live there again. The man who had spent 4 months at the exact center of the rumor that would follow Philip for the rest of his life left royal service that same year because of a divorce of his own, and carried both stories out of the country with him, together, permanently, and he had the letters. 60 years of correspondence from the Duke of Edinburgh, in his own hand, on his own paper, the private opinions of a famously blunt man, written to somebody he trusted absolutely, across the entire distance from a young naval officer with an uncertain future to the oldest serving consort in British history. Letters of that density, spanning that length of time, written by a man who was constitutionally incapable of saying anything blandly, would today be worth, to an auction house, to a serializing newspaper, to a biographer working on commission, more than most people will earn across their lifetimes. Parker kept them in Australia. Nobody has ever published so much as a paraphrase of their contents. What became of the physical letters after his death has never, to public knowledge, been established. Now the market, because the market is the part people forget to ask about, and it is the part that makes the discipline remarkable, rather than merely private. In 1958, that material would have made him comfortable. He needed money then, freshly divorced, freshly unemployed, 2 children to support, and no obvious next career for a man whose entire professional identity had been built around a job he had just been forced out of. This was the point at which the offer would have made the most immediate, practical sense, and it was also the point at which the market for this kind of material was, relatively speaking, thin. A tell-all in 1958 would have earned him a newspaper fee and a great deal of social ruin for a fraction of what the same information would fetch later. By the 1970s it was worth considerably more. The royal family had settled into the television age. The 1969 documentary Royal Family had already shown the public what an appetite there was for footage of the family behaving like a family, and Fleet Street had begun to understand that royal stories sold papers on a scale nothing else quite matched. By the 1990s, it was worth a fortune, because the royal publishing market had gone through a transformation that nobody sitting in Wheelers in 1957 could possibly have predicted. Servants published. Marion Crawford, Crawfie, the royal governess, had broken the seal decades earlier with a memoir gentle enough by later standards, but scandalous enough at the time, to see her exiled from the family's affection for the rest of her life. A warning example that hung over every subsequent household employee for a generation. Bodyguards published, private secretaries published, in careful, lawyered volumes that said just enough to sell and not quite enough to be sued over. There was a serialization economy built around Sunday newspapers willing to pay 6 or 7 figures for exclusive extracts, a lecture circuit in the United States that paid handsomely for anyone who could claim genuine proximity to the family, a documentary industry that never stopped needing new talking heads, and a global appetite that showed no sign of exhausting itself decade after decade. The Andrew Morton book on Princess Diana appeared in 1992 and changed the economics permanently. It was later revealed that Diana herself had cooperated secretly, speaking into tape recordings passed through an intermediary rather than to Morton directly, and the revelation of that cooperation, when it eventually came out, did something to the entire industry that no single celebrity memoir before it had managed. It proved that the people closest to the story could tell it themselves, on their own terms, and be believed over the institution they had left. After 1992, everyone with proximity to the family understood exactly what proximity was worth, and precisely how to monetize it without technically breaking a confidentiality agreement. Mike Parker was alive throughout all of it, in a country where the British press could not easily reach him, and where he owed nobody in England anything at all, no pension depending on institutional goodwill, no social circle that required royal approval, no professional reputation still tied to Buckingham Palace's opinion of him. Of every person who might plausibly have written a book, he was among the very few who could have done it, with genuinely nothing to lose. He was approached, repeatedly. He had been approached since 1957, in the immediate aftermath of his divorce, when a newspaper willing to pay for his side of the Britannia story would have solved every financial problem he had at a stroke. And the approaches continued for the rest of his life, through publishers, through journalists, through the occasional intermediary who thought a personal appeal from an old naval colleague might succeed where a check had failed. The answer was always the same, and he was not silent about everything, which is the detail that makes the silence legible rather than merely stubborn. A man who refuses every single question, on every single subject, forever, starts to look less like a man of principle and more like a man with something specific to hide. Parker never gave that impression, because he drew a line with genuine precision rather than blanket refusal. He gave interviews about the accession. He talked about Kenya, about the eagle over the Aberdares, a detail from the treetop stay that entered royal legend, the story that an eagle had been seen circling overhead on the night the old king died, and the new queen, unknowing, watched it from the platform, about the moment the news came, about what it had been like to serve in the Navy alongside Philip, before either of them had any idea what the following decades held. That is where the half the world line comes from. Mike Parker, on the record, decades after the fact, describing his friend's face in the garden at Sagana Lodge. He was a good storyteller, and he was willing to be one, about the public events he had witnessed, the ones that belonged to history rather than to one particular marriage. What he never once discussed was Philip in private, the marriage, the temper, the arguments, the grievances, the parts of a man that only a friend sees, and that a friend of 40 years has had far more opportunity than anyone else alive to see clearly. He drew a line, and the line was in a particular place, and it never moved, not when the money increased, not when the pressure from journalists increased with it, not when his own reputation could plainly have benefited from a single well-placed correction. And then there is the single exception, the one occasion when he spoke about the private material, and it is the moment that tells you who he was. Late in life, with the rumors about Philip's supposed infidelities long since fossilized into common knowledge, repeated so often across so many decades that most people who believed them could no longer say where they had first heard them, Mike Parker said, flatly and without qualification, that the Duke had been entirely faithful to the Queen. No hedging, no, as far as I know, no carefully lawyered formulation designed to protect him from a future contradiction. A direct statement from the one man alive who had spent more private, unsupervised time with Philip across more decades than almost anyone else on Earth, including the 4 months at the exact center of the original rumor. Look at what that statement actually is. He had spent 40 years refusing to say anything about his friend's private life, on the principle that it was not his to discuss, that a friend's interior life was not raw material for a magazine feature, no matter what a magazine was prepared to pay for it. Then he broke his own rule, and when he broke it, he did not open a door, he shut one. The only time he ever traded on his access, the transaction went entirely in the other direction. He spent the credibility he had spent 40 years accumulating, not to sell a story, but to close one down for good. And he did it knowing exactly how it would read, and how little it would likely achieve. A man in his position defending his friend is the least persuasive witness available. Everyone assumes he would say that, and the assumption is not unreasonable. A denial from the person with the most to gain by lying carries less weight in the ordinary run of things than a denial from a disinterested stranger. He said it anyway, because it was what he believed to be true, and because, an old man by then, with far fewer chances left than he once had, he had run out of other ways to help. He was not alone in it. Lord Charteris, the same Martin Charteris who had driven from Nyeri with the news in 1952, and who went on to serve as the Queen's private secretary for a further 2 decades before his own retirement, said, in his own later years, that there was no evidence of any kind that Philip had strayed, and said it with the specific weight of a man whose entire career had depended on knowing exactly where the bodies, so to speak, were actually buried. Philip himself, when a journalist finally put the question to him directly, gave the reply that has been quoted more than almost anything else he ever said on the subject, that he had not been anywhere in over 40 years without a policeman accompanying him. It is, on its face, a joke, dry, evasive, very much in his register, but it is also, if you take it at face value, a genuinely difficult claim to square with the alternative. A man permanently accompanied by royal protection officers for 4 decades would have left the thinnest imaginable paper trail for any of the rumored affairs to have actually occurred undetected. None of it made any difference. It never does. The rumor had passed the point, long before Parker or Charteris or Philip himself ever addressed it, where evidence was relevant to whether people believed it, and it will very likely outlive everybody who was ever in a position to actually know the truth of it. There is one more question, and it is the one this whole story has been building toward. What was he actually protecting? Not an affair. Everyone who was in a position to know has said there was nothing, and 40 years of extremely well-funded searching. Fleet Street, at the height of its resources and its appetite, private investigators, a tabloid culture willing to pay enormous sums for a single photograph, has produced nothing that has ever stood up. Not a scandal, in any sense a newspaper would recognize, and not a crime, and not a buried document waiting in some solicitor's vault for the right moment to surface. He was protecting a man's interior life, that is all. The private, ordinary, unheroic record of what Philip had actually been like in the years when everything was taken from him at once. The name, the career, the house, the argument he could not win, and every remaining hour of his own life reorganized around a role nobody had designed with him in mind. The bitterness, the temper, the things said in rooms with the door shut, the specific shape of a proud, capable man's unhappiness at discovering that the rest of his life had already been decided by people who had never once asked him. That is not a secret in the tabloid sense. It is something better and rarer, the thing a friend knows and does not say, because saying it would reduce a person to their worst hours, and because a friend's whole use, in the end, is that he refuses to do that, even when refusing costs him everything a story like that would have paid. Mike Parker had watched the crown arrive in a garden in Kenya and take his friend's life away. He was the only outsider who saw it happen at that exact moment, on the floor, at the wireless, before either of the two people it was about had been told. He never told anyone what it looked like from the inside. He died in Melbourne on the 29th of December, 2001, and took it with him. He died in Melbourne on the 29th of December, 2001, aged 81, in the city where he had been born, having lived long enough to see almost every other figure of his generation's royal circle either publish, cooperate with a biographer, or die with their own silence intact, and to have chosen, every single time the choice came up again, the same answer. The obituaries ran in the British papers, and they were respectful, and they were also, inevitably, organized around 1957, around the divorce and the resignation, because that was the shape of the story the public record actually offered. That was the shape available. A man who had spent 44 years declining to complicate the story could hardly expect the story to complicate itself at the end, on his behalf, once he was no longer there to correct it. Lieutenant Commander John Michael Avison Parker, CVO, AM. Melbourne, to Narvik, to Malta, to Kenya, to Gibraltar, and home again. A naval career that had put him under fire in the Second World War, years before any of the royal chapter began. A fact the later story tends to crowd out entirely, though it was that service record, as much as anything, that had first recommended him to Philip as an equerry in the first place. Philip outlived him by 19 years. He died at Windsor on the 9th of April 2021, 2 months short of his 100th birthday, and the funeral was conducted under pandemic restrictions that stripped it down to something he would probably have preferred anyway. No state pageant, no foreign dignitaries filling a nave, none of the ceremonial apparatus he had spent 70 years finding faintly ridiculous, even while enduring it. A Land Rover he had helped design himself, down to the specification, carrying the coffin. 30 people, the legal maximum under the restrictions then in force. His wife of 73 years, sitting alone in a mask in St. George's Chapel, distanced from every other mourner in the building, because the rules that had been written for the whole country applied to her as well, and she did not ask for an exception. By then everything about that marriage had been examined, dramatized, speculated upon, and sold many times over, in books, in documentaries, in a prestige television series that reconstructed private conversations nobody outside the room had ever recorded, presenting invented dialogue with enough confidence that viewers came away believing they had learned something true. The rumors from 1956 were still in circulation, 70 years old by the time of his death, and utterly unkillable, repeated by people 2 and 3 generations removed from anyone who had actually been aboard that yacht, who could not have named a single primary source if pressed. And in all that time, across every one of those 70 years, nothing had ever come out about the private Philip from the one man who had known him best in the years when it would have mattered most, the years before the role had calcified into a public performance, when he was still, underneath everything, simply a young officer who had lost his career and his name and did not yet know what, if anything, would be left of him once the adjustment was complete. That is the whole story, and it deserves to be stated without ornament. Go back to the room. A wooden lodge in the Kenyan highlands on a warm afternoon in February. A man on his hands and knees below the level of a desk, crawling toward a wireless set, so that a young woman writing a letter to her father does not look up and see something in his face before anyone has decided how she should be told that everything about her life has just changed. Everything about Mike Parker is in that image, and it took a whole life to earn the right to read it properly. He is on the floor because there is no dignified way to do the right thing in that particular moment. Dignity was never available to him there, only usefulness. He is out of sight because the point is not to be seen doing it, and a man who does the right thing chiefly to be seen doing it has generally misunderstood the assignment. He is protecting her from perhaps 90 seconds of unnecessary knowledge, which is a small kindness of no historical consequence whatsoever, invisible in every official account of that day, and which he performed instinctively, at speed, under pressure, without being asked, and without any expectation of credit. That is the man. He kept doing exactly that, in one form or another, for the next 49 years, and the only real difference between the version of him on the floor in 1952 and the version of him refusing a fortune in 1992 is that the later versions of the same instinct cost him his career, his reputation, on at least one continent, and effectively his country. So, the secret. The title of this story promises one, and there is one, and it is not what anybody has spent 70 years and a great deal of money looking for. It was never an affair. Nobody has ever produced a shred of anything resembling evidence, and the two people best placed to know, the man who spent 4 unsupervised months at the supposed center of it, and the private secretary who had access to every relevant file for the following 2 decades, both said, on the record, that there was nothing to find. It was never a scandal. There is no buried document, no hushed-up incident, no crime, no confession waiting in a vault to be opened on some future anniversary. What Mike Parker knew, and what he took with him into a Melbourne hospital in the last week of 2001, was simply this: what it actually looked like, from a few feet away, when the Crown arrived without warning and took a man's entire life away from him in the space of one radio bulletin. He was standing in the garden, or near enough to it. He watched it land. He described that part once, briefly, decades later, on the record. Half the world dropped on him, and never felt so sorry for anyone, and the description has survived, quoted since in every serious account of that day, and he never went any further than that single sentence in 4 decades of being asked to. He knew what Philip said in the private rooms after each of the constitutional defeats that followed: the name, the house, the precedents, every argument lost in sequence across 2 years. He knew what the man was like at 32, having lost the navy that had been the whole of his identity, the family name he could not pass to his own sons, the house he had wanted, and every remaining hour of his own life to a schedule other people had written for him, with nowhere to put any of it except a room containing one Australian equerry who would not repeat a word of it to anyone, for as long as he lived. That is not a scandal. It is worse, in a way, and more valuable, and infinitely harder to keep. It is a person, at their least defended, in the years they would least want remembered, and the fact that it never once leaked, across 49 years, and an industry built entirely around leaks of exactly that kind, is the actual story here. He could have sold it in 1958, when he was broke and freshly divorced, and had 2 children to support, with no clear next career. He could have sold it in 1992, when the market was at its absolute peak, and the whole world, in the wake of the Morton book, was suddenly buying anything with a genuine royal provenance. He could have used a fraction of it, at almost any point across those 4 decades, simply to correct the untrue thing that had been said about him personally on 3 continents. The Britannia rumor, the whispered suggestion that his own divorce had somehow been entangled with Philip's supposed infidelities, a slur that attached itself to his name and never fully came off. That would not even have been a betrayal of his friend. That would have been ordinary, forgivable self-defense, the kind almost anyone in his position would have reached for eventually. He never did, and this is the part that ought to be uncomfortable, because it does not resolve, and it was never going to. He was not rewarded for it. There was no vindication, no late-life redemption arc, no moment where the record was quietly corrected and the world finally understood what he had actually sacrificed and why. He did not live to see the record corrected, because the record has still not been corrected. The false version is still the popular one, still in the books, still recycled in documentaries and dramatizations, still what most people would tell you if you asked them, casually, what they'd heard about that royal marriage. His silence bought him nothing at all, in any currency the world recognizes, except the fact of having kept it. It cost him a marriage he had, by his own account, already damaged himself before any of this began. It cost him a career that had been the whole of his adult identity up to that point. It cost him a reputation he never fully got back on the continent where the story mattered most, and it cost him a country he did not choose to live in again for the rest of his life. What he got in return was a friendship that ran for 59 years without a break. Unusual in itself, for any friendship formed that young and tested that hard. And the private, unwitnessed knowledge that when it had finally been his turn to be tempted, he had not been the sort of man who talks. The most dangerous thing in a palace is not a secret. Palaces are full of secrets, and always have been, and most of them, examined closely, turn out to be dull. A scheduling dispute, a minor financial irregularity, an old grudge between two households that nobody outside the building would find remotely interesting. The dangerous thing is a friend, because a friend sees the version of you that no institution, no press office, no careful public performance can protect. And every friend, eventually, has a bad year, or a bill to pay, or a reputation of his own that a single well-timed story could repair. Prince Philip had one for 59 years, and the man never once opened his mouth. He was on the floor in Kenya, out of sight, doing something nobody would ever thank him for, on the very first day any of this began. He stayed there, in a sense, out of sight, doing the unglamorous, unrewarded, correct thing, for the rest of his life. Mike Parker was not the only one who went into that household knowing everything and came out saying nothing. 25 years later, another man walked into the same building, took a job serving another prince, spent 12 years standing in rooms where the most damaging conversations of the century were happening, and then, when his own turn to choose arrived, made the opposite choice. He talked, and it destroyed him. That story is on the screen now.